On my wedding day, the man I once loved walked in as my cousin's fiancé. But what no one knew was, he was the father of my child. Aurora Kinsley had everything money could buy. Power, beauty, a name that opened doors. But on the night she chose freedom for the first time, she made one mistake that would destroy everything. Because some choices don't just change your life, they rewrite it completely. Chapter 1. The Perfect Prison. Aurora Kinsley had mastered the art of looking happy. The chandeliers above her shimmered like captured stars, casting golden light across the grand ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter floated through the air. Silk gowns brushed against polished marble floors, and expensive perfumes blended into a scent that whispered wealth, power, and perfection. And at the center of it all was Aurora. Elegant.
Poised.
Untouchable. She moved through the crowd like she belonged to it, her champagne-colored gown hugging her figure with effortless grace. Diamonds rested against her collarbone, catching the light every time she turned her head. "Miss Kinsley, you look absolutely stunning tonight." She smiled. "Thank you. Your parents must be very proud."
She smiled again.
"They always are." It came easily now. Too easily. The smile. The polite laughter. The perfect responses. Aurora had rehearsed them her entire life. "Darling, stand up straight. Smile, Aurora. Don't embarrass us. People are watching." People were always watching. Her gaze drifted across the room until it landed on them, her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Kinsley stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by powerful men and elegantly dressed women. Her father's hand rested lightly on a politician's shoulder, his expression sharp, calculating. Her mother laughed at something someone said, her posture flawless, her eyes briefly scanning the room, until they found Aurora. A small nod. Not warm, not loving, just approval. Aurora's chest tightened. Approval. That was the closest thing to affection she had ever known. "Aurora, dear." She turned, her smile already in place. "Mrs. Whitmore," she greeted warmly. The older woman air-kissed both her cheeks. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman. Your mother must be thrilled." "I hope so," Aurora replied softly. Hope. Even now, she was still hoping. "You'll make a wonderful wife someday," Mrs. Whitmore continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Men admire a woman who carries herself like you do." Aurora let out a light laugh, the sound perfectly measured. "Is that so?" "Oh, absolutely. In fact, I heard there are already a few interested families." Of course there were. There were always interested families. Aurora wasn't just a daughter. She was an asset, a connection, a future alliance waiting to be negotiated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I think I need some air." Mrs. Whitmore waved her off. "Of course, dear. Don't stray too far." "Don't stray too far." Aurora nodded, but for the first time that night, she intended to. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet. Too quiet. The music became distant, muffled behind heavy doors. The laughter faded. The expectations softened, just a little. Aurora exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as though she had just taken off an invisible weight. She walked forward, her heels echoing against the marble floor, each step feeling freer than the last. No eyes watching. No voices judging. No expectations pressing down on her chest. Just silence. She stopped by a tall window, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Cars moved like streams of gold below. Life was happening out there, messy, unpredictable, real.
Free.
Aurora pressed her palm lightly against the glass. "What does that feel like?" she whispered. "To live without permission. To choose without fear. To be her." Aurora. Her entire body stiffened. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her mother. "I've been looking for you." Aurora turned slowly, her mask already sliding back into place. "I just needed a moment." Her mother's eyes scanned her, sharp and assessing. "You shouldn't disappear like that. People notice." "Of course they do." They're asking about you, her mother continued. The Davenport family is here tonight. Aurora's stomach tightened slightly. I know, she said carefully. Good, her mother replied. Then you also know how important this is. There it was. Not concern, not care. Importance. You'll be meeting them properly before the night ends, her mother added. Try to be more present. More present. Aurora forced a small smile. Of course. Her mother studied her for a moment longer, as if searching for cracks. Then, satisfied, she nodded. Don't keep them waiting. And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving Aurora standing there again, alone. Aurora didn't move immediately. The silence returned, heavier this time. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, perfect, polished, and completely unfamiliar. More present, she whispered. A soft, almost bitter laugh escaped her lips. I'm not even here. Not really. Not in this life. Not in this body that moved and smiled and spoke on command. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had waved, greeted, performed all evening. Whose life was she living? Because it didn't feel like hers. The music from the ballroom swelled faintly again, as if calling her back. Back to the performance. Back to the expectations. Back to the cage. Aurora inhaled slowly, then exhaled. And something inside her shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to make her step away from the window. Enough to make her walk past the ballroom doors. Without opening them, her heart began to pound.
Fast. Loud.
Unfamiliar. What are you doing?
She didn't stop.
The hallway stretched ahead, leading toward the private exit. Each step felt like crossing a line she had never dared to cross before. Her mind raced. Her mother's voice echoed. Her father's expectations pressed in. The future they had planned for her loomed ahead, but something stronger pulled her forward. Something reckless. Something dangerous. Something that felt like freedom. She reached the exit. Her hand hovered over the door handle. For a second, just one. She hesitated. This was not who she was. She was the obedient daughter. The perfect woman. The one who stayed. Always. But tonight, Aurora Kinsley didn't want to stay. She pushed the door open. Cool night air rushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. The city sounds were louder here, cars, voices, life unfolding without rules or rehearsals. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, from something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Excitement, freedom, possibility. Aurora stepped outside, the door closing softly behind her. And for the first time in her life, she didn't look back. Chapter 2. One Night of Freedom. Aurora didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't go back. The night air wrapped around her like a quiet rebellion, cool against her skin as she stepped further away from the grand estate behind her. The sound of the gala faded with every step, replaced by something far more alive, the distant hum of the city. Real life. Unfiltered. Uncontrolled. Her heels clicked against the pavement at first, confident, practiced until she slowed. Then stopped. Then laughed.
Softly.
Almost like she didn't recognize the sound. What am I doing? She whispered to herself. No driver. No security. No permission. If her parents knew. Aurora shook her head quickly, pushing the thought away. Not tonight. Tonight, she didn't want to be Aurora Kinsley, the perfect daughter. She just wanted to be Aurora. Her gaze drifted across the street, catching the glow of a softly lit lounge tucked between two buildings. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't loud. It wasn't filled with people trying to impress anyone. It looked calm, normal. Her heart gave a small, uncertain beat. Then, before she could overthink it, she walked in. The atmosphere inside was nothing like the gala. Low lights, soft music, quiet conversations that didn't feel forced. No one turned to stare at her. No one whispered. No one cared who she was. Aurora paused just inside the entrance, taking it all in like someone stepping into a completely different world. And for a moment,
she didn't know where to go.
First time here? The voice came from her left.
Deep. Calm.
Effortless. Aurora turned. And that was when she saw him. He wasn't trying. That was the first thing she noticed. While every man at the gala had been polished, rehearsed, calculated, this man leaned casually against the bar like he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. His sleeves were rolled up slightly, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. But it was his eyes. They weren't scanning her dress or judging her appearance. They were observing her, like he was trying to understand her. Aurora felt it instantly. That unfamiliar pull. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her voice softer than usual. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." There was a brief pause.
Not awkward.
Just quiet. "You look like you don't belong here," he added. Aurora raised a brow slightly. "And you do." He shrugged lightly. "I belong wherever I decide to be." Something about the way he said it. No arrogance. No performance. Just certainty. Aurora found herself studying him now.
Confident, she said.
"Honest," he corrected. That made her smile.
A real one this time.
It surprised her so much, she almost looked away. Almost. "What about you?" he asked. "Where do you belong?" The question hit deeper than it should have. Aurora opened her mouth, then closed it, because for the first time in a long time, she didn't have an answer. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted quietly. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not curiosity. Understanding. "Good," he said simply. Aurora frowned slightly. "Good. Most people never question it," he replied. "They just live the life handed to them." Her breath caught, because that was exactly what she had been doing. "And you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Did you question yours?" A small pause. Then, every day. There it was again. That honesty.
Raw.
Unfiltered. Dangerous. Aurora felt herself leaning into the conversation without realizing it. "What made you stop?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment longer this time. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter. "I didn't." Their eyes held. And, for a second, the world around them faded. No expectations. No titles. No pressure. Just two strangers standing in the same moment, telling each other the truth. Aurora exhaled slowly. "I don't even know your name," she said. He straightened slightly, as if remembering himself. "Matthew." A beat. "Matthew Hale." Aurora nodded softly. "Aurora." He tilted his head. "Just Aurora?" She hesitated. Then, for reasons she couldn't explain, "Yes." And somehow, that felt like the most honest thing she had said all night. Minutes turned into something longer. Aurora didn't keep track.
She didn't check the time.
She didn't think about the gala. She didn't think about her parents. She just stayed. They talked about everything and nothing. Music. Travel.
Choices.
Regrets. Matthew didn't ask her who she was. He didn't care about her last name. And for the first time, Aurora didn't feel like she had to perform. "You think too much," he said at some point. She laughed softly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "I know enough," he replied calmly. "You pause before you answer. You measure your words." Her smile faded slightly. Habit. Or fear. The word lingered. Aurora looked down at her glass, then back at him. Maybe both. Matthew nodded, like that made perfect sense. "And what are you afraid of?" he asked. Aurora hesitated. Her instinct was to deflect, to laugh it off, to say something safe. But something about him made that impossible. "Losing everything," she said finally. A quiet truth. Matthew watched her carefully. "And what do you have?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. Aurora blinked. She stopped. Because the answer didn't come easily.
Wealth.
Status.
A name.
But none of it felt like something she had. More like something she was trapped inside. Her silence said everything. Matthew leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then maybe," he said softly, "you're not the one losing." Aurora's heart skipped. That sentence. It felt like someone had just unlocked something inside her she didn't know existed. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. And smiled. Not the practiced one. Not the perfect one. But something softer. Something real. Time passed.
Too much of it.
Aurora glanced toward the entrance briefly, her reality creeping back in like an unwelcome shadow. She should leave. She knew she should. Her parents would notice. Questions would come. Consequences would follow. This moment, it wasn't meant to last. Nothing real ever was. I should go, she said quietly. Matthew didn't react immediately. He simply studied her, like he understood what she wasn't saying. Yeah, he said after a moment. You probably should. But neither of them moved. Aurora felt it. That pull again. Stronger now. Dangerous. If she stayed, this would mean something. If she left, this would disappear. Just like everything else. Her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. Her heart beat faster. Louder. For once. Not out of fear, but desire. For more. For something different. For something hers. Aurora looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had spoken to her like she was human, not an expectation. At the stranger, who somehow felt familiar. Safe.
Real.
And then, she made a decision she had never made before. She leaned back into her seat. I'll stay, she said softly. Just 4 words. But they changed everything. Matthew's gaze held hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Yeah, he asked. Aurora nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. Just a little longer. And somewhere deep inside her, Aurora Kinsley knew this was the beginning of something she would never be able to undo. Endo. Chapter 3. The night that changed everything. The night should have ended. It didn't. Aurora lost track of time somewhere between his words and the way he looked at her when she spoke.
Not like he was impressed.
Not like he was judging. But like he was listening. Really listening. And that alone felt dangerous. The lounge had grown quieter. A few people had left. The music softened into something slower, almost intimate. The kind of silence that made conversations feel heavier, more honest. Aurora rested her chin lightly against her hand, studying him. You're not what I expected, she said. Matthew raised a brow. And what exactly were you expecting? She smiled faintly. I don't know, someone more guarded. He let out a quiet chuckle. I could say the same about you. Aurora looked away briefly. Most people don't get past the surface, she said. And I did, he asked. Her gaze returned to his. There was no hesitation this time. Yes. A pause stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Tell me something honest, Matthew said suddenly. Aurora tilted her head slightly. I've been doing that all night. Not completely, he replied. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You think I'm hiding something? I think, he said slowly. You've been taught to hide everything. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Aurora exhaled, her smile fading just a little. That obvious? Only if you're paying attention. She looked down at her fingers, tracing the rim of her glass. Then, quietly, I don't remember the last time I made a decision for myself. Matthew didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. He just stayed. I've always done what was expected, she continued. What was right. What made sense to everyone else. And what about you? He asked gently. Aurora let out a soft, almost broken laugh. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. Another silence. But this one felt heavier, like something was shifting. Matthew leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. Then I'll ask you. Aurora looked up. Their eyes locked. What do you want? He said. The question wrapped around her chest, tightening slowly. What did she want? Not what was planned. Not what was expected. Not what was safe. What did she want? Aurora opened her mouth. But no words came out. Because the truth was, she didn't know. And that scared her more than anything. I don't know, she whispered. Matthew nodded like he understood that completely. That's a start. A start, she echoed. You can't lose yourself forever, he said. At some point something pulls you back. Aurora swallowed. And if it doesn't? His gaze softened slightly. Then maybe you haven't met the right reason yet. The air between them shifted again. Subtle, but undeniable. Aurora felt it in the way her heartbeat picked up. In the way her thoughts blurred at the edges. in the way she suddenly became aware of how close they were sitting. Too close. Not close enough. "Tell me something," she said softly, her voice almost cautious now. Matthew watched her. "Anything." She hesitated. Then, "What are you afraid of?" For the first time that night, Matthew didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. His gaze drifted for just a second, like he was deciding how much to reveal. Then he looked back at her. "Waking up one day," he said quietly, "and realizing I lived my whole life for other people." Aurora's breath caught, because that was her life.
Right now.
"And you think you won't?" she asked. Matthew's expression didn't change. "I think I fight it every day." Something inside Aurora shifted again. Deeper this time. More dangerous. Because now, she didn't just feel seen. She felt understood. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they weren't saying, of everything they were starting to feel. Aurora's fingers brushed lightly against the table as she shifted, her hand moving closer. Not intentionally, not entirely, but close enough. Matthew noticed. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly, then returned to hers. And something unspoken passed between them. A question. A warning. A choice. "You should go," he said quietly. Aurora blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You said you had somewhere to be," he added. "A life waiting for you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Responsibility. Reality. Everything she had stepped away from. Aurora felt it all rushing back. The gala. Her parents. The expectations. The future that had already been decided for her. This moment. It didn't belong in that world. It couldn't survive there. So yes, she should go.
She knew that. She felt that.
She understood that. And yet, she didn't move. "Do you want me to go?" she asked softly. Matthew held her gaze. A long pause. Then,
"No."
The honesty in that single word sent a quiet shiver through her. Aurora's heart began to race. Not from fear. From something far more reckless. Something she had spent her entire life avoiding.
Desire.
Not just for him, but for what this moment represented. Freedom.
Choice.
Herself. "I don't want to go," she admitted. The words felt unfamiliar on her tongue, like something she wasn't supposed to say. Matthew didn't respond immediately, but his eyes, they said everything. Aurora inhaled slowly, then stood, not to leave, but to close the distance between them. Just slightly. Just enough. Matthew remained still, watching her carefully, giving her time, giving her space, giving her a choice. And for the first time in her life, Aurora made one. Not for her parents. Not for expectations. Not for appearances. For herself. The space between them disappeared. Not rushed. Not forced. But inevitable. Like it had been building from the moment they met. Aurora felt it in the way her breath caught. In the way her heart pounded louder with every second. In the way the world around them seemed to fade into nothing. There was no gala. No expectations. No future waiting to trap her. Just this moment. This feeling. This choice.
And she chose it.
Fully.
Completely.
Without fear. Hours later, the city was quieter. The night deeper. And Aurora lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing in ways they never had before. Everything felt different.
Her body.
Her mind. Her heart. Like something inside her had been unlocked, and there was no closing it again. Beside her, Matthew shifted slightly, his presence grounding and unfamiliar all at once. Aurora turned her head, studying him in the dim light. A stranger. And yet, not anymore. She didn't know what this meant. Didn't know what would happen when morning came. Didn't know how this night would fit into the life waiting for her outside. But she knew one thing, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest. Nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere, in the quiet space between choice and consequence, Aurora Kinsley stepped into a future she could no longer control. Chapter 4. Morning without goodbye. Morning came too quickly. Aurora felt it before she saw it. The soft warmth of sunlight brushing against her skin, the unfamiliar stillness in the room, the silence. Too quiet. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, her body heavy with sleep, and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't think, didn't remember. She simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, caught between a dream and reality. Then it all came rushing back. The lounge, the conversation, the way he looked at her, the way she felt. Aurora's breath hitched slightly. Matthew. She turned quickly. The space beside her was empty.
Cold.
Untouched. Like no one had ever been there. Aurora blinked, her heart skipping in confusion. Maybe he was in the bathroom. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet closer around herself, her gaze drifting toward the door.
Silence.
No movement. No sound. Matthew, she called softly. No answer. A small frown formed on her face. She waited. A few seconds. Then a few more. Still nothing. The silence began to feel different now. Not peaceful. Not calm. But final. Aurora swung her legs off the bed, her bare feet meeting the cool floor as she stood. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching for something, anything, that would explain his absence. There was nothing. No note. No message. No trace. Just absence. Her chest tightened. Not painfully. Not dramatically. Just enough to make her feel it. That quiet, unexpected disappointment. He left, she whispered to herself. The words sounded strange out loud. Unfamiliar. Because no one had ever left her before. Not like this. Not without a word. Aurora wrapped her arms lightly around herself, exhaling slowly as she tried to steady the sudden swirl of thoughts rising in her mind. It was fine. It had to be fine. Last night wasn't. She paused. Wasn't what? Important?
Real? No.
It had been real. Too real. And maybe that was exactly why. She stopped herself. No, she said quietly, shaking her head. Don't do that. Don't turn it into something more. Aurora walked toward the window, pulling the curtain slightly to let the morning light flood the room. The city stretched out before her again.
Alive.
Moving. Unbothered. Completely unaware that something inside her had changed overnight. She stared at her reflection in the glass. Same face. Same features. Same woman. But it didn't feel the same. There was something different in her eyes. Something softer and somehow stronger at the same time. Like a part of her had woken up and refused to go back to sleep. It was just one night, she said, more firmly this time. A decision. A boundary. A way to protect herself. That's all it was. A moment. A mistake. An escape. People did things like that all the time. They moved on. They forgot.
So would she.
She had to. Because the life waiting for her didn't have space for this. For him. For whatever that connection had been. Aurora turned away from the window, her movements slower now. More deliberate. Controlled. She gathered her things quietly, dressing in silence, piece by piece rebuilding the version of herself the world expected. The perfect daughter. The composed woman. The one who never lost control. But her hands paused briefly as she adjusted her dress. A memory flashed. His voice. His eyes. The way he had asked her, "What do you want?" Aurora's fingers tightened slightly against the fabric. Then she let go. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. Because wanting things had never changed anything. Not for her. By the time she stepped outside, the world had already moved on. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued. Unaffected. Aurora inhaled deeply, the morning air filling her lungs.
Fresh. Clean.
Like a reset. She could go back now. Back to the gala. Back to her family. Back to the life that had been waiting for her. And she would pretend. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't stepped outside the lines. Like she hadn't, for one reckless night, chosen herself. But as she walked away, her step steady, her expression calm, there was something she couldn't shake. Not the memory, not the feeling, but the question. A quiet, lingering thought that settled deep in her chest. If it meant nothing, Why did it feel like everything had changed? Aurora didn't have the answer. Not yet. And somewhere far beyond her understanding, beyond her control, the consequences of that night had already begun. Quietly, unseen, but inevitable. Chapter 5. 2 Pink Lines. It started with something small. So small, Aurora almost ignored it. At first, it was just the fatigue. A kind of tiredness that didn't make sense. She would wake up exhausted, move through the day, like she was carrying something heavy inside her, and by evening, she felt completely drained. Maybe I'm just stressed, she told herself. That made sense. There had been a lot going on. Returning home, family pressure, endless expectations waiting for her again. Yes, stress. That had to be it. Then came the nausea. Subtle at first. A slight discomfort in the mornings. A strange sensitivity to smells. A sudden loss of appetite for things she once enjoyed. Aurora frowned at her reflection one morning, brushing her hair back slowly as she studied her face. "You're overthinking," she murmured. But her body didn't feel like it was overthinking. It felt like it was trying to tell her something. Something she wasn't ready to hear. Days passed. Then another week. And then, Aurora froze. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bathroom sink.
No.
Her heart began to beat faster. No, that's not. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to calculate, trying to remember, trying to make sense of something that suddenly felt very wrong. Her cycle. It was late. Not by a day. Not by 2. But enough. Enough to make her chest tighten. Enough to make her mind race. No, she whispered, shaking her head slightly. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Not from just. Aurora stopped herself. Her breath caught. Because deep down, she knew. The pharmacy bag sat on the counter. Unopened. Untouched. Aurora stared at it like it was something dangerous. Like opening it would make everything real. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, then pulled back. Not yet. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was nothing. Maybe. Stop, she whispered to herself. Her voice was unsteady now, because hope in this moment felt like a lie. Aurora closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply before forcing herself to move. One step, then another, until she stood in front of the sink again, the test in her hand. Small, simple, but it felt like the weight of her entire life rested on it. Minutes later, Aurora sat on the edge of the bathtub, waiting, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart pounding so loudly it filled her ears. Time slowed. Every second stretched painfully. She stared at the floor, unable to look, unable to breathe properly, unable to think clearly, because if she really allowed herself to think, she would fall apart before she even knew the truth. A memory flashed. His voice. What do you want? Aurora's chest tightened sharply. This isn't what I want, she whispered quickly, like saying it would make it true, like denying it would change the outcome. But deep down, something inside her was already breaking. The silence in the bathroom became unbearable. Aurora swallowed hard, her throat dry as she slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes moved, hesitantly, carefully, until they landed on the test. And for a second, her mind refused to understand what she was seeing. 2 lines.
Pink. Clear.
Unmistakable. Aurora blinked.
Once.
Then again. As if the image would change. As if she had made a mistake. As if reality would correct itself. But it didn't. It stayed the same. Unmoving.
Certain.
Final. No. The word came out as a breath. Barely audible. Her head shook slowly, her body going cold as the truth settled into her bones. No, this isn't. Her voice broke. Her hands began to tremble as she reached for the test, staring at it like it had betrayed her. This can't be happening. But it was. It already had. Her thoughts spiraled.
Fast. Chaotic.
Relentless. Her parents. The scandal.
The shame.
The questions. The disappointment. Everything she had been raised to avoid. Everything she had been trained to never become. Crashing down all at once. I can't, she whispered, her voice shaking now. I can't do this. Her breathing quickened. Her chest tightened painfully. Her vision blurred slightly as panic began to take over. What am I going to do? She said, louder this time, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. There was no answer. No solution. No way to undo this. Aurora slid down slowly from the edge of the tub, her back hitting the cold tile wall as she brought her knees to her chest. The test still clutched in her hand, her entire body trembling now. I've ruined everything. The words came out broken.
Shattered.
Because in her world, this wasn't just a mistake.
It was a disaster.
A scandal. A stain that could never be erased. Her father's face flashed in her mind. Her mother's voice. The expectations. The image. All of it. Destroyed. And then, something else hit her. Harder.
Deeper.
More personal. Matthew. Aurora's breath caught. She closed her eyes tightly, her grip on the test tightening. One night. One choice. One moment of freedom. And now.
This.
A tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. And another. Until she couldn't stop them. Her body shook as the reality finally broke through every wall she had tried to hold up. This was real. There was no escaping it. No pretending it didn't happen. No going back to who she was before. That version of her
was gone.
Aurora let out a broken sob, her head falling forward as everything inside her collapsed at once.
Fear. Shame.
Confusion. Regret. And something else. Something she wasn't ready to face. Her life, the one she had always known, was over. And as she sat there, on the cold bathroom floor, holding the truth in her trembling hands, Aurora Kinsley realized nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6, Exile. The silence didn't last long. It never did in the Kinsley house. Aurora barely remembered how she got home that day. Her mind had been numb, her body moving on instinct, her thoughts trapped in a loop she couldn't escape. 2 lines. 2 pink lines. Over and over again. Aurora. Her father's voice cut through the air like a blade. Sharp. Controlled. Dangerous. She stood in the center of his study, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. Her mother stood beside him, silent. Watching. Always watching. I'll ask you one time, her father continued, his tone calm in a way that made it worse. And I expect the truth. Aurora swallowed hard.
Her throat felt dry. Tight.
Is it true? The room felt smaller. The walls closer. The air heavier. Aurora opened her mouth. But the words refused to come out. Not because she didn't have them, but because saying them would make everything real. And once it was real, there would be no going back. Her mother stepped forward slightly, her voice softer, but no less firm. Aurora, she said, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder. As if this wasn't already unbearable. Aurora's fingers trembled slightly. Then, barely above a whisper, yes. The word fell into the room like a stone. Heavy. Final. Irreversible. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her father didn't shout. Didn't react the way she expected. Which made it worse. Much worse. He simply exhaled slowly, turning away from her as he ran a hand over his face. Disappointment. Cold. Measured. Controlled. You've embarrassed this family, he said flatly. Aurora's chest tightened painfully. Her mother's voice came next. What were you thinking? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Do you have any idea what this could do to us?
To us.
Not to her. Never to her. Aurora lowered her gaze, her vision blurring slightly as the weight of their words pressed down on her. I didn't plan for this, she whispered. That's exactly the problem, her father snapped, turning back to her. You didn't think at all. The words hit harder than anything else. Because maybe. He was right. What's done is done, her mother said sharply, stepping in before the situation escalated further. We don't have time to dwell on mistakes. Mistakes. Aurora flinched slightly. Her hand instinctively moved, just for a second, toward her stomach. Then dropped.
Quickly.
Like she wasn't allowed to feel that. Her parents exchanged a look. A silent conversation. A decision already made. We've handled worse, her father said finally, his tone shifting into something colder, more strategic. This will not ruin us. Aurora's heart sank, because she knew what that meant. Control. Containment. Erasure. You'll be leaving, her mother said. Aurora looked up sharply.
What?
Tonight, she continued. Everything has already been arranged. Leaving where? Aurora asked, her voice shaking now. Abroad, her father replied. Somewhere quiet, discreet. You'll stay there until this situation is resolved. Resolved. Aurora's chest tightened. You mean until I have the baby, she said softly. Neither of them corrected her. That was answer enough. No one can know about this, her mother added firmly. Do you understand? Aurora stared at her, at the woman who had raised her, who had taught her how to walk, speak, behave, and now, how to disappear. I understand, she said quietly. Because what else could she say? No didn't exist in this house. It never had. That night, Aurora left. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Just absence. Just another version of her life being rewritten without her permission. The months that followed felt like a blur. A quiet, endless stretch of days that melted into each other. The house she was placed in was beautiful. Of course it was. Everything in her life always looked perfect on the outside. But inside, it was empty, lonely, cold. Aurora had never felt so alone. There were no friends, no familiar faces, no one who knew her, except Mrs. Hartwell, the woman her parents had assigned to assist her. At first, Aurora expected another observer, another pair of eyes reporting back. But Mrs. Hartwell was different. Gentle,
Kind.
patient. You should rest, she would say softly. Eat a little more. You're not alone, dear. Aurora didn't believe that at first. But over time, those small words began to matter. As her body changed, so did something inside her. At first, she had tried not to think about it, tried not to feel, tried not to connect, because connection made things harder, more painful, more real. But then, she felt it. A small movement.
Soft.
Almost like a whisper. Aurora froze. Her hand slowly moved to her stomach. There it was again. A gentle flutter. Life.
Real. Alive.
Inside her. Her breath caught. And for the first time since everything began, Aurora didn't feel fear. She felt something else. Something unexpected. Something warm. Tears filled her eyes as she sat there, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Hi, she whispered softly. Her voice trembled. Not from panic this time, but from something deeper. I didn't know how to feel about you, she admitted quietly. The words came slowly,
Carefully.
but I think I'm starting to understand. Months later, the pain came. Sharp, overwhelming, unforgiving. Aurora gripped the sheets tightly, her body trembling as wave after wave crashed through her. Breathe, Aurora, Mrs. Hartwell's voice urged gently. You're doing so well. I can't, Aurora cried out, her voice breaking. You can, she said firmly. You're stronger than you think. Stronger. Aurora held on to that word. Through the pain, through the fear, through the uncertainty, until a cry filled the room. Small, fragile, but powerful enough to silence everything else. Aurora's world stopped. Your son, Mrs. Hartwell said softly. Son. The word echoed in her chest. Aurora's arms trembled as they placed him in her embrace. So small, so warm, so real. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him. At the tiny life she had been so afraid of. The life she thought would destroy everything. And yet, in that moment, he felt like the only thing that made sense. Alvin, she whispered. The name came naturally, like it had always been his. Hi, Alvin. Her voice broke into a soft laugh through her tears. You don't know this yet, she said gently, brushing her finger against his tiny hand, but you've already changed everything. He shifted slightly, his small fingers curling instinctively around hers. Aurora's heart clenched. Tightly. Completely. Irrevocably. I was so scared of you, she admitted softly. But I'm not anymore. Her tears fell freely now. Not from fear, not from shame, but from something new, something powerful, something unshakable.
Love.
Aurora held him closer, pressing a soft kiss against his forehead as her eyes closed briefly. And, in that quiet moment, she made a promise. Not to her parents, not to the world, not to expectations, but to him. I will protect you, she whispered, her voice steady now.
Certain.
No matter what it costs me. And for the first time, Aurora Kinsley wasn't just someone's daughter. She was something more, something stronger, something that could not be controlled. A mother. Chapter 7. The Return. 2 years changed everything. And yet, as the car slowed to a stop in front of the Kinsley estate, it felt like nothing had changed at all. Aurora stared out the window, her fingers curled tightly in her lap. The gates opened slowly, just as they always had.
Grand.
Imposing. Unwelcoming. The long driveway stretched ahead, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and silence. Everything looked the same. Too perfect. Too controlled. Too familiar. Her chest tightened. I'm not ready, she whispered. But she knew. Readiness had never mattered. Aurora? Mrs. Hartwell's gentle voice broke through her thoughts. Aurora turned slightly, her eyes softening as they landed on the woman who had become her only source of comfort over the past 2 years. I'm fine, she said quickly. It was a lie. A practiced one. Mrs. Hartwell didn't challenge it. She never did. Instead, she simply gave Aurora a knowing look. The kind that said, you don't have to pretend with me. Aurora looked away, because pretending was all she had left. From the back seat, a small voice stirred. Mama? Aurora's heart clenched instantly. She turned quickly, her expression softening in a way it never did for anyone else.
Alvin. Her son.
Her world. He blinked up at her sleepily, his small hand reaching toward her. Aurora didn't hesitate. She leaned closer, taking his hand gently in hers. I'm here, she whispered. His fingers curled around hers instinctively.
Trusting.
Safe. Unaware. And that was what made this so much harder. The car came to a complete stop. The engine went quiet, and reality rushed in all at once. Aurora's grip on Alvin's hand tightened slightly. Too soon. This was happening too soon. You don't have to rush, Mrs. Hartwell said softly. But they both knew. They didn't have a choice. Aurora stepped out of the car first. The air felt different here. Colder. Heavier. Like it carried expectations in every breath. She turned, her heart already resisting what she was about to do. Mrs. Hartwell stepped out next, carefully lifting Alvin into her arms. Aurora watched the movement, every second of it, memorizing it, because something inside her told her this moment would stay with her for a long time. Mama? Alvin reached for her again. Aurora's composure cracked instantly. She stepped forward, taking him into her arms, holding him tighter than she meant to. I'm here, she repeated softly, pressing her face against his hair. Her eyes closed briefly. Just for a second. Just to hold on to this feeling a little longer. You'll come with me? He asked innocently. Aurora's breath caught. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. She pulled back slightly, forcing a smile onto her lips. Not today, my love. His small face frowned in confusion. Why? Aurora's throat tightened painfully. Because I'm not allowed to. Because my life isn't mine. Because loving you has to be hidden. But she couldn't say any of that. So instead, you're going to stay with Mrs. Hartwell for a little while, she said gently. And I'll come see you soon.
Soon.
A word that meant everything and nothing at the same time. I want to stay with you, Alvin said softly, his voice trembling just slightly. Aurora's heart shattered. Right there. In that moment. She swallowed hard, her arms tightening around him again. I know, she whispered. I want that too. More than anything. Mrs. Hartwell stepped closer, her expression gentle but firm. Aurora, she said quietly. It was time. Aurora shook her head slightly. Not yet. Just a little longer. Please. But time didn't wait. It never did. Slowly, reluctantly, Aurora placed Alvin back into Mrs. Hartwell's arms. Her fingers lingered, just for a second longer than necessary, then slipped away. Alvin reached for her again. Mama. Aurora stepped back, quickly, before she could change her mind.
Before she could break.
I'll see you soon, she said, her voice barely steady. A promise. One she didn't know how to keep. She turned, because if she didn't, she wouldn't be able to leave. Not him. Not this. Not the only thing in her life that felt real. The doors of the estate opened before she reached them. Right on time. Of course. Everything in this house was always timed, controlled, expected. Aurora. Her mother's voice.
Calm. Composed.
Unmoved. Aurora stopped, then turned slowly. Mrs. Kinsley stood at the entrance, elegant as ever, her expression unreadable. Her father stood just behind her, watching, measuring, assessing. Aurora straightened slightly. Automatically, the version of her they knew slipping back into place. I'm back, she said quietly. Yes, her mother replied. You are. No warmth, no embrace, just acknowledgement. Her father stepped forward slightly. You handled things well, he said. Aurora blinked. Handled things. As if the last 2 years had been a task. A situation. Something to manage, not something to survive. We trust you understand the importance of discretion, her mother added. Aurora nodded slowly. I do. Because she had learned. The hard way. Good, her father said. Then, his tone shifted.
Subtly.
But enough. There's something we need to discuss. Aurora's stomach tightened. She knew that tone. It wasn't a conversation. It was a decision. Already made. Her mother stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Aurora. You've been away long enough, she said. It's time to focus on your future. Future. Aurora's chest felt tight again. Heavy, like something was closing in. What do you mean? She asked carefully. Her parents exchanged a brief glance. Then her father spoke. We've made arrangements. Aurora's heart skipped. A quiet sense of dread settling deep in her chest. Arrangements. She knew that word. She had lived her entire life under it. Aurora, her mother said, her voice calm, deliberate. You're getting married. The words landed like a final blow.
Silent.
Heavy. Unavoidable. Aurora didn't speak. Didn't react. Didn't move. But inside, something broke. Again. And somewhere far behind her, in the arms of another woman, her son was being driven away. End of Chapter 7. Fire. Next, Chapter 8 is where. Chapter 8. A Deal in Disguise. The word marriage lingered in the air long after it was said. Heavy. Unavoidable. Final. Aurora stood in the center of the room, her body still, her mind anything but. You're getting married. Her mother's voice echoed in her head like something distant, unreal. Married, she repeated quietly, as if saying it out loud might help it make sense. But it didn't. Because this wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. Already made. Her father gestured toward the sitting area. Sit down, Aurora. She obeyed.
Of course she did.
She always had. The room was immaculate, just like everything else in the house. Neutral tones. Expensive furniture. No warmth. Aurora sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap as her parents took their seats across from her. Like a meeting. Like a transaction. The Davenport family, her father began, has been a long-standing associate of ours. Aurora nodded faintly. She had heard the name before. Of course she had. In her world, names like that carried weight, influence,
power.
And now, her mother added smoothly, we have an opportunity to solidify that relationship. Opportunity. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly. What does that have to do with me? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Her father's gaze settled on her.
Steady. Direct.
Everything. A pause. Then, you'll be marrying Alexander Davenport. The name landed without emotion. Because Aurora didn't know him. Not really. Just another man with status. Another name attached to wealth. Another life she would be expected to step into without question. I haven't even met him, she said quietly. You will, her mother replied. But that's not the point. Of course it wasn't. Aurora let out a slow breath, her chest rising and falling unevenly. So, this is just an arrangement? Her father didn't hesitate. Yes. No pretense. No attempt to soften it. Just truth. Cold and clear. Aurora looked between them, something fragile flickering in her eyes. And what if I don't want this? The question hung in the air. For a moment, just one, there was silence. Then her mother spoke. You don't have that luxury. The words were calm, measured, but they cut deeper than anything else. Aurora swallowed hard, her throat tightening painfully. Why? She asked, her voice softer now. Why does it have to be like this? Her father leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening. Because actions have consequences, Aurora. There it was. Not spoken directly, but understood. The pregnancy, the secret, the mistake. This was the price. We've protected you, her mother continued. We've protected this family. Now it's time for you to do your part. Aurora's chest tightened. I did my part, she said quietly. I left. I stayed away. And now you'll secure our future, her father cut in firmly. Final. Unyielding. Aurora fell silent, because there was nothing left to say. Every argument she could make, every emotion she could express, meant nothing here. This wasn't about her happiness. It never had been. Alexander is a good match, her mother added, as if that should come for her. He's well-respected, successful, from a powerful family. Aurora let out a hollow breath. Does he want this? She asked. A brief pause. Then, yes.
Of course he did.
Men like him always did. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about legacy, control, advantage. Aurora looked down at her hands.
Still.
Controlled, but trembling slightly beneath the surface. 2 years ago, she had made one decision for herself. One night, one moment of freedom. And now, her entire life was being rewritten to make up for it. Matthew's face flashed briefly in her mind. The way he had looked at her. The way he had asked her.
What do you want?
Aurora's chest tightened painfully. Because now, she knew the answer. But it didn't matter. You'll meet him tomorrow, her father said, breaking the silence. Aurora blinked. Tomorrow? There's no reason to delay, her mother replied. The sooner this is settled, the better. Settled. Like a deal. Like a contract. Like something that needed to be finalized. Aurora lifted her gaze slowly, looking at them both. Really looking at the people who had raised her, who had shaped her, who had decided every step of her life, including this one. Will it make you happy? She asked suddenly. The question caught them off guard. Just for a second. Her mother's expression shifted slightly. Her father didn't respond. Aurora held her gaze. If I do this, she continued softly, will it make you happy? Another pause. Longer this time. Then her mother spoke. It will make things right. Not yes. Not happiness. Just
right.
Aurora nodded slowly, because that was the closest answer she would ever get. Silence settled over the room again. But this time, it felt final. Aurora inhaled deeply, then exhaled. And something inside her quieted. Not healed. Not accepted. Just silenced. Okay, she said. The word was soft, barely above a whisper. But it changed everything. Her parents didn't react immediately, as if they had expected it, as if this had always been the outcome. I'll do it, Aurora added, her voice steadier now, stronger. Not because she believed in it, but because she had no choice. Her mother nodded once, satisfied. Her father leaned back slightly. Decision confirmed. Aurora stood slowly, her movements calm, controlled, like she wasn't breaking inside. Because that's what she had learned. How to fall apart, quietly. As she turned to leave the room, her step steady, her expression unreadable. One thought echoed in her mind.
Clear.
Sharp. Unavoidable. This wasn't a marriage. It was a sacrifice. And she had just agreed to it. Chapter 9. The Man She Doesn't Love. Aurora knew the moment she saw him, not because of who he was, but because of what she didn't feel. The Davenport estate was everything she expected.
Grand.
Impressive. Carefully curated to reflect power without needing to announce it. Aurora stepped out of the car, her posture straight, her expression composed.
Perfect.
As always. Remember, her mother said beside her, her voice low but firm, first impressions matter. Aurora almost smiled. If only her mother knew. She had been making perfect first impressions her entire life. They were led inside by a staff member, through halls lined with art and silence. Everything about the place felt controlled, not cold, not unwelcoming, just measured, like every detail had been chosen with intention. Mr. Davenport will be with you shortly. Aurora nodded politely as they were ushered into a sitting room. Her parents took their seats. Aurora remained standing for a moment longer, breathing, preparing. Then she sat. Seconds later, the door opened, and he walked in. Alexander Davenport. He was exactly what she expected.
Tall.
Well-dressed. Effortlessly composed. The kind of man people noticed without him needing to try. The kind of man her parents would approve of instantly. His gaze found hers almost immediately. Sharp. Assessing. But not intrusive. Just aware. Aurora, he said, his voice smooth, controlled.
Not warm.
Not cold. Just precise. Alexander, she replied. Their names hung between them like a formality already completed. Introductions followed. Polite. Predictable. Their parents spoke more than they did. Business.
Partnership.
Future alignment. Aurora listened. But not really. Because her attention kept drifting back to him. Not to his words, but to what was behind them. Or rather, what wasn't. Shall we? Alexander said after a while, his gaze returning to her. Aurora blinked slightly. He gestured toward the adjoining balcony. A moment alone. Her parents didn't object. Of course they didn't. This was part of the process. Aurora stood, smoothed her dress, and followed him. The balcony overlooked an expansive garden. Beautiful. Perfectly maintained. Like everything else. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, you don't want this. His voice broke the silence.
Calm. Certain.
Aurora turned to look at him.
Surprised.
Not by the statement, but by how easily he said it. I could say the same about you, she replied. Alexander's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. Fair. Silence again. But this time, it felt different. Less forced. Less performative. Aurora studied him quietly. Up close, he was even more composed. Every movement intentional. Every expression controlled. You're very honest, she said after a moment. So are you, he replied. A beat. Then, you just hide it better. Aurora exhaled softly. He wasn't wrong. Does that bother you? She asked. Alexander leaned lightly against the railing, his gaze drifting toward the garden.
No.
A pause. It makes things easier. Easier. Aurora's brows drew together slightly.
How?
He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw it. Not in his words, not in his posture, but in his eyes. Distance. This marriage, he said calmly, is not about emotion. There it was.
Clear.
Unfiltered. Aurora held his gaze. And what is it about? Stability, he replied. Alignment. Mutual benefit. Each word landed like a contract being signed. Aurora let out a quiet breath. So, we're just agreeing to play our roles? Alexander didn't hesitate. Yes. No sugarcoating. No false promises. No illusion of romance. Aurora nodded slowly. Because, strangely, this honesty was easier to accept than lies. And what happens, she asked softly, if one of us wants more? Alexander's expression didn't change. Then they'll be disappointed. The words were simple, but final. Aurora looked away briefly, her gaze settling on the garden below. Beautiful.
Perfect.
Empty. You're very sure of that, she said. I am, he replied. Another silence. But this one felt heavier. Aurora turned back to him, studied him again.
Carefully.
He was everything her parents wanted. everything this life required, everything that made sense. And yet, there was nothing. No spark, no curiosity, no pull, no warmth, just understanding, and something dangerously close to indifference. "You're not a bad man," she said quietly. Alexander's brow lifted slightly. "That sounds like a consolation." "It's not," Aurora replied. "It's the truth." A small pause. Then, "You're just not someone I could ever," she trailed off. "Love," he finished for her. Aurora met his gaze.
Didn't deny it.
Alexander nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. "That won't be a problem," he said. Aurora's chest tightened slightly, not because she expected more, but because of how little there was. No disappointment, no reaction, no resistance, just agreement. And, in that moment, Aurora understood something clearly. This marriage would not hurt her, not in the way love could, because love would never exist in it. And somehow, that felt worse. "Are we understood?" Alexander asked. Aurora held his gaze for a long second, then nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "We are." Because this wasn't a beginning. It was an arrangement. And she had just met the man she would spend her life with, without ever loving him. Chapter 10. Wedding Preparations. The house was alive with movement, voices, footsteps, instructions being given and followed without question. Everything was in motion. Everything was happening fast. And Aurora felt completely still inside it all. "Miss Kinsley, please stand." She obeyed. Of course she did. The dress was breathtaking. Hand-stitched lace, delicate beading that shimmered under the soft lights. A masterpiece designed to be remembered. The kind of dress little girls dreamed about. The kind of dress women waited their whole lives to wear. Aurora stared at her reflection and felt nothing. "Perfect," the designer said with a satisfied smile. "Absolutely perfect." Aurora nodded faintly. "Perfect." That word again. Behind her, her mother watched closely, observing, approving, ensuring everything aligned with expectation. "We'll take it," Mrs. Kinsley said smoothly. No hesitation. No need for Aurora's opinion. Because this wasn't about what she wanted. It never was. The next few days blurred together. Fittings, meetings,
Guest lists.
floral arrangements, menu tastings. Every detail meticulously planned. Every second accounted for. Aurora moved through it all like a ghost. Present.
Seen.
But not really there. "Smile, Aurora." She smiled. "Stand here."
She stood.
Turn slightly. She turned. It became automatic. A performance she knew by heart. But inside, something was unraveling. Late one evening, Aurora found herself alone in her room. For the first time all day. Silence. Real silence. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as the weight of the day finally caught up with her. Her reflection stared back at her from across the room. Still polished. Still composed. Still not her. Aurora walked toward the mirror slowly, as if approaching a stranger. She studied her own face. The calm expression, the controlled eyes, the absence of everything she used to feel so freely. "Who are you?" she whispered. The question barely left her lips, but it lingered, heavy. Her gaze dropped slightly, to her hands. Then, without thinking, she placed one gently over her stomach. A habit, one she hadn't broken, one she wasn't sure she ever would. Her chest tightened instantly, because the memory came rushing back, uninvited, unstoppable. A quiet room, soft breathing, tiny fingers wrapped around hers. Alvin. Aurora's eyes closed briefly, and just like that, the walls she had been holding up all day began to crack. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "I'm so sorry for leaving, for choosing survival over presence, for becoming someone he might not recognize." A single tear slipped down her cheek, then another. Aurora pressed her lips together, trying to steady herself. But it was too much. Because this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about everything she had lost to get here. Everything she had given up. Everything she would never get back. Her freedom, her voice, her choices. And somewhere buried beneath all of that, the memory of a night that had once felt like escape. Matthew. His name didn't leave her lips, but it echoed in her mind.
Clear.
Unavoidable. The way he had looked at her, the way he had seen her, the way, for just a moment, she had felt real. Aurora's chest ached, because that version of her, the one who laughed freely, who spoke without fear, who chose without permission, felt like someone else now. Someone she had imagined. A life she almost lived, but didn't. A knock on the door broke through her thoughts. Sharp. Immediate. Aurora, her mother's voice called. "We need you downstairs." Aurora inhaled deeply, wiped her face quickly, restored the composure that had taken years to perfect. "Coming," she replied. Steady. Controlled. Like nothing had happened. One last glance at the mirror. And just like that, she stepped back into the role. Because no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she wanted to run, she wouldn't. She couldn't. Aurora straightened her shoulders, turned toward the door, and walked out, leaving behind, just for a moment, the life she wished she had chosen. Chapter 11. A Bride in Chains. The day arrived without asking her. Morning came softly, golden light slipping through silk curtains, resting gently on untouched surfaces.
Calm.
Peaceful. Deceptively so. Because inside Aurora, there was nothing calm about it. "Good morning, Miss Kinsley." Voices filled the room before she could respond. Stylists, makeup artists, assistants moving with quiet urgency. Aurora sat in front of the mirror. Still.
Silent.
As they began, brushes against her skin, fingers adjusting her hair. Soft murmurs of approval. "She's stunning. Absolutely breathtaking. Mr. Davenport is a lucky man." Aurora heard every word, and felt none of it. She watched herself come together piece by piece. Foundation. Lips.
Eyes.
A bride. But not herself. Smile just a little.
She did.
Just enough.
Just right.
Time moved quickly after that. Too quickly. The dress was brought in carefully, handled like something sacred. Aurora stood as they helped her into it, layer by layer. Fabric settling against her skin. Heavy, restrictive, beautiful, like a cage made of lace. When they were done, she turned toward the mirror. And there she was.
Perfect.
Flawless. Every detail exactly as it should be. Aurora stared at her reflection for a long moment. Then quietly, almost unconsciously, she reached up and touched her own cheek. Cold. "This is really happening," she whispered. No one responded, because no one heard her. A knock came at the door. "It's time." Of course it was. Everything was always on time. Aurora moved through the hallway slowly, her heels echoing softly against the polished floors. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the end of the hall, her father waited. He looked at her, really looked, and, for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression.
Pride.
Satisfaction. Approval. "You look beautiful," he said. Aurora nodded faintly. "Thank you." He offered his arm. She took it, and just like that, they began walking. The doors ahead opened, and the world shifted. Music filled the air.
Soft.
Elegant.
Perfect.
Rows of guests turned. Eyes followed her. Admiration. Curiosity. Expectation. Aurora didn't see them. Not really. Because her focus landed on one thing. The man waiting at the end of the aisle. Alexander. He stood tall, composed, unmoved, watching her approach. Their eyes met briefly. And in that moment, Aurora searched for something, anything, a flicker of emotion, a trace of warmth, a sign that this meant more than an agreement. But there was nothing. Just calm, just certainty, just distance. Aurora looked away, because somehow that hurt more than anything else. Step by step, she moved forward, each one pulling her further away from herself, further away from the life she could have had. A life where she chose, where she loved, where she lived without permission. a life that no longer existed. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Alexander's. The contact was brief, controlled, and then he let go.
Just like that.
Aurora stood beside the man she was about to marry, her hand steady, her heart anything but. The ceremony began. Words were spoken, vows were read, promises made. Aurora heard them all, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, because none of it felt real. Not the setting, not the moment, not even the man beside her. And yet,
this was her life now.
Do you, Aurora Kinsley? Her breath caught slightly. Take Alexander Davenport to be your husband? The question echoed, louder than anything else. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly, and suddenly, everything slowed. For just a moment, her mind drifted to a different night, a different version of herself. Laughter, freedom, a man who looked at her like she mattered. Matthew. Her chest tightened painfully, because that moment, that feeling, was the closest she had ever come to choosing her own life. And now, she was choosing this instead. Or rather,
accepting it.
Aurora? The officiant's voice pulled her back. All eyes were on her, waiting, expecting. Her mother's gaze.
Sharp, steady.
Her father's silence. Heavy. Alexander beside her.
Calm.
Unwavering. Aurora inhaled slowly, deeply, and something inside her went quiet. Not resolved, not healed, just silent. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady, controlled, practiced. I do. The words left her lips.
Soft.
Final. And in that moment, Aurora felt it. Not joy, not excitement, but the unmistakable weight of something closing.
A door. A choice.
A version of herself she would never return to. The ceremony continued. Applause followed. Smiles filled the room. But Aurora didn't react, because deep inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't a beginning. It was an ending, and she had just sealed it with two simple words. Chapter 12. The reception shock. The applause hadn't stopped. Laughter, music, glasses clinking in celebration. The reception was everything it was meant to be. Grand, elegant, unforgettable. Aurora stood at the center of it all, smiling,
nodding,
playing her role flawlessly. Congratulations. Such a beautiful ceremony. You look stunning. She responded the same way each time. Gracious,
polite, perfect.
But inside, she felt nothing. Alexander stood beside her, equally composed, equally distant. A perfect match, at least on the surface. Are you all right? He asked quietly at one point, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Aurora turned slightly toward him, met his gaze. I'm fine.
A lie.
But one he didn't question. Good, he replied simply. And that was the end of it. Because that's how this worked. No digging. No probing. No emotion that required effort. The music shifted to something softer. Couples began to move toward the dance floor. Aurora felt the room pressing in on her. The noise. The lights. The expectations. I need some air, she said quietly. Alexander nodded once. Don't be long. Not concern. Just acknowledgement. Aurora stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the edge of the room. Toward space. Toward quiet. Her heart felt tight again, like it had been all day, like it hadn't had a chance to breathe. She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the side of her dress as she walked. And then,
she stopped. Not because she meant to,
but because someone, pulled her attention without warning. A voice. Familiar. Too familiar. She turned slightly.
And saw him.
Everything inside her went still. Matthew. He stood across the room, dressed just as sharply as the rest, blending perfectly into the elegance of the night. But he didn't feel like part of it. Because to Aurora, he didn't belong to this world. He belonged to a memory, a night, a version of herself she had buried. Her breath caught. Her chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt.
No, it couldn't be.
But it was. He hadn't seen her yet. Or maybe he had, and just hadn't reacted. Aurora's fingers curled slightly at her side. Her mind racing. What was he doing here? The question barely had time to form before she saw her. Olivia. Standing beside him.
Close.
Comfortable. Familiar. Aurora's stomach dropped. Olivia was smiling. Radiant.
Happy.
Her hand rested lightly on Matthew's arm, and he didn't move it away. Instead, he leaned slightly toward her, said something that made her laugh softly. The sound didn't reach Aurora, but the sight was enough. No, the word left her lips before she could stop it. Barely a whisper. Her pulse began to race.
Fast.
Uneven. And then, as if the universe hadn't done enough, Olivia turned. Her eyes found Aurora instantly, and her smile widened. Aurora. Too bright. Too excited. Too unaware. Aurora couldn't move. Olivia began walking toward her, Matthew beside her, each step closing the distance, each second tightening something inside Aurora's chest.
Run.
The thought came fast,
Sharp.
instinctive, but her feet didn't move, because she couldn't run. Not here.
Not now.
Not like this. Aurora, there you are, Olivia said, her voice warm, genuine. Aurora forced herself to breathe, to stand, to exist in the moment she didn't want to be in. Olivia, she managed, her voice steady despite everything. And then, Olivia turned slightly. There's someone I want you to meet. Aurora's heart slammed against her chest.
No.
But it was already happening. This is my fiancé, Olivia said, her tone filled with happiness. Aurora's world narrowed. Matthew. Silence. A single moment stretched endlessly between them. Aurora looked at him, really looked, and everything came rushing back. That night, that connection, that feeling she had never been able to forget. And in his eyes,
She saw it.
recognition. Sharp, immediate, unavoidable. He knew. Of course he knew. His expression didn't change. Not fully. But something shifted. Something subtle. Something only she would notice. Aurora. Olivia continued, oblivious. We've met. Matthew's voice cut in.
Calm.
Controlled. Aurora's breath caught. Olivia blinked in surprise. You have?
A beat.
Aurora forced herself to speak. Yes. Her voice felt distant, like it didn't belong to her. Briefly. The lie settled between them.
Thin.
Fragile, but necessary. Olivia smiled, unbothered. Oh, that's perfect. Small world, isn't it? Aurora didn't answer, because her focus was locked on him. Matthew, the man who had once made her feel free. The man she had never expected to see again. Standing here, in front of her, engaged. To someone else. To someone she knew. To someone who trusted her. Aurora's chest tightened painfully, because this wasn't coincidence. This was something else. Something cruel. Something inevitable. And then, his eyes met hers. Fully. No interruption. No distraction. Just him. And her. And everything they weren't saying. The room faded. The noise disappeared. The world narrowed to that single moment. Recognition. Memory. Tension. And something dangerously close to unfinished. Aurora couldn't breathe, because in that silent exchange, she realized the truth. That night hadn't ended. It had followed her here, right into the life she was trying to survive. And it had just become impossible to ignore. Chapter 13. Eyes That Remember. The room never noticed. The laughter continued. Music played softly in the background. Glasses clinked in celebration. Everything moved forward, as if nothing had changed. But for Aurora, everything had. She felt it in the way her breath refused to settle, in the way her chest rose too quickly, in the way her body remained perfectly still, while everything inside her wasn't. Shall we join the others? Olivia's voice broke the silence between them, light and unaware. Aurora blinked, pulled back into the moment. Yes, she said softly. Matthew stepped aside slightly, allowing Olivia to move ahead.
Polite.
Controlled.
Distant.
Aurora hated how natural he looked, like he belonged here, like he hadn't just shattered something inside her. She began to walk.
Slowly. Carefully.
But she felt it. His presence behind her. Close enough to matter. Far enough to pretend it didn't. You look different. His voice.
Low.
Quiet. Just enough for her to hear. Aurora's steps faltered for half a second, then steadied. So do you, she replied without turning. A pause. That night. Don't. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Silence followed. Heavy. Immediate. Aurora exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress, grounding herself. We shouldn't talk about it here, she added, her tone softer now. Another pause. You're married. The words weren't a question. Aurora swallowed. Yes.
A beat. To him.
She didn't need to look to know who he meant. Yes. Silence again. But this one felt different. Not empty. Not distant.
Full.
Of everything they weren't saying. Aurora finally turned. Just slightly. And there he was. Matthew. Looking at her like he had that night. Not at her dress. Not at the image she was presenting. But at her. Really seeing her. And that was what made it dangerous. You didn't say goodbye. The words were quiet, but they landed hard. Aurora's breath caught. Because she hadn't. She had woken up to emptiness. To absence. To silence. I could say the same, she replied. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. I stayed, he said. Aurora frowned. What? I stayed, he repeated. You left. The words hit her unexpectedly. I didn't, she stopped herself. Because what could she say? That she had been taken away? That her life wasn't her own? That she didn't get to choose what happened next? Excuses. All of them. I didn't have a choice, she said instead. Matthew's expression shifted. Just slightly. But not enough. There's always a choice, he said. Aurora shook her head faintly.
No.
Not in my world. A pause. And for a moment, just a moment, something softened in his gaze. Like he almost understood. But then, it was gone. Replaced with distance. With control. Just like hers. You seem fine now, he said. Aurora almost laughed.
Fine.
Yes, she replied. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The words tasted like something bitter. Matthew studied her. Closely. As if trying to see past the answer. And that was the problem. He could. You're not, he said quietly. Aurora's heart skipped. Don't do that, she whispered. Do what? Look at me like that. A pause. Like what? Aurora held his gaze. And for a second, her composure slipped. Like you still know me. Silence. Because he did. And she knew it. Matthew stepped closer. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to shift the air between them. I do know you, he said. Aurora's breath caught. No, she said softly. You knew me. Then nothing's changed, he replied. The words hit deeper than they should have. Because something had changed. Everything had. And yet, standing here, looking at him, it didn't feel like it. Aurora's chest tightened. Stop, she said again. But this time, her voice wasn't steady. Matthew noticed. Of course he did. That night wasn't nothing, he said quietly. Aurora closed her eyes briefly. Because that was the problem. It hadn't been nothing. It had been everything. And now, it was back. Standing right in front of her. You're engaged, she said, opening her eyes again. To Olivia. Matthew didn't respond immediately. His silence said enough. And I'm married, she added. Another silence. But this one felt heavier. Final. And yet, neither of them moved. Neither of them walked away. Because something held them there. Something unfinished. Something neither of them had been able to let go of. Aurora looked at him. Really looked. And she saw it. Not just recognition. Not just memory. But something deeper. Something alive. Something that hadn't faded. Her chest tightened again. Because she felt it too. No matter how much she tried to bury it. No matter how much she tried to ignore it. It was still there. Between them. Unspoken. Unresolved. unavoidable. And in that moment, without saying a single word, they both understood the same thing. What they had felt that night hadn't ended. It had only been waiting. Chapter 14. Pretending Strangers. The room was too bright, too loud,
Too alive.
and yet, Aurora felt like she was moving through it underwater. Every sound dulled, every movement slowed, except for one thing. Him. She didn't need to look to know where Matthew was. She felt it. In the air. In the tension that refused to leave her chest. Aurora. She turned instinctively. Alexander. Standing beside her again. Composed as always. Watching her carefully now. "You've been away for a while," he said. Not accusatory, but not unaware either. "I needed air," she replied smoothly. His gaze lingered on her for a second longer than usual, as if measuring the truth in her words. "And, did you find it?" he asked. Aurora held his gaze. Steady. Controlled. "Yes."
A lie.
Again. Alexander nodded once. Accepting it, or choosing to. "Good," he said. "We're about to greet my partners." Of course they were. Aurora straightened slightly. Reset. Recomposed. "Lead the way," she said. And just like that, the performance resumed. They moved through the crowd together. A perfect image. A perfect match. Aurora smiled when expected. Spoke when necessary. Listened when required. But her awareness never left. Because across the room, he was there. Matthew. And this time, he wasn't alone. Olivia stood beside him again, her arm lightly looped through his. Comfortable. Possessive. Unknowing. Aurora's chest tightened. "Mr. Davenport." A voice pulled her attention away. Alexander was already engaged in conversation, introducing her effortlessly. "My wife, Aurora." The word landed differently this time.
Wife.
Aurora smiled politely, extending her hand as expected. "Pleasure to meet you." More greetings. More conversations. More moments that meant nothing. And yet, everything felt like it meant too much. Because every now and then, her eyes betrayed her. They drifted.
To him.
And every time, he was already looking.
Quick glances.
Sharp. Intentional. Then gone. Like it never happened. Like they were strangers. Exactly like they were supposed to be. But the silence between those glances said everything. "Matthew, come meet them." Olivia's voice carried lightly across the space. Aurora's heart skipped.
No.
But it was already happening. They were walking toward her, step by step, closing the distance again. Aurora felt her posture straighten automatically, her expression smoothing into something neutral, untouchable. Alexander turned slightly, noticing them. "Olivia," he greeted.
Warm.
Familiar. "Congratulations," Olivia said brightly, her smile wide. "You both look incredible." "Thank you," Aurora replied. And then, it happened again. That moment. That brief, dangerous second. When her eyes met Matthew's. Nothing changed on his face. Nothing shifted. But she felt it. That same pull. That same awareness. That same unspoken connection. "We really should all get together sometime," Olivia continued, oblivious. "Now that everything is aligned." Aligned. Aurora almost flinched. "That would be nice," Alexander responded smoothly. Aurora nodded. Because she had to. "Yes," she added. "That would be nice." The word felt wrong. Because nothing about this was nice. Nothing about this was simple. "Matthew has been so busy lately," Olivia went on, smiling up at him. "I barely get his attention anymore." Aurora's chest tightened. Matthew didn't respond immediately. And for a split second,
Aurora wondered why.
then, "I'm here now," he said calmly. But his eyes didn't stay on Olivia. They shifted. To Aurora. Just for a second. Too quick for anyone else to notice. Too long for her to ignore. Aurora looked away instantly. Because she couldn't afford that. Not here.
Not now.
"We should get back," she said quietly to Alexander. He studied her briefly. Then nodded. "Of course." They exchanged polite goodbyes. Smiles. Words that meant nothing. And then, They walked away. But the distance didn't help. Because the tension followed. It clung to her, wrapped around her, refused to let go. Aurora's steps slowed slightly as they moved further into the crowd. Her breath uneven again, her chest tight. You know him. Alexander's voice.
Low.
Measured. Aurora stilled internally. But her expression didn't change. I've met him, she replied carefully. A pause. Alexander glanced at her briefly. That's not what I ask. Aurora's fingers curled slightly at her side. Danger. That's what this was becoming. I know of him, she corrected smoothly. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, all right. Just one word. But it carried something. Awareness. Suspicion. Or maybe just observation.
Aurora didn't ask.
Because she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The music grew louder again. The crowd thicker. The night continuing like nothing had shifted. But everything had. Because now, this wasn't just memory. It was presence. It was proximity. It was something real. Something dangerous. Something impossible to ignore. Aurora inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. But it didn't work. Because no matter how far she walked, no matter how perfectly she played her role, she could still feel it. Behind her, around her, between them, unfinished, and growing stronger. Chapter 15. Olivia's Possession. The night should have been winding down, but for Aurora, it felt like it was just beginning. The reception had softened into something more intimate. Fewer formalities, more lingering conversations, looser laughter. But the tension remained. Aurora stood near one of the tall glass windows, a half-full glass untouched in her hand. Her reflection stared back at her faintly.
Composed. Calm.
Convincing.
A lie.
Because across the room, Matthew stood with a small group, engaged in conversation. And yet, every now and then, his attention drifted back to her. Aurora felt it every time, like a quiet pull she couldn't escape. She turned away. Again. You'll wear a hole into the floor if you keep pacing like that. Aurora stilled. Olivia.
Her voice was light.
Playful. But something beneath it wasn't. Aurora turned slowly, forcing a small smile. I didn't realize I was pacing. Olivia stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Elegant. Confident. Controlled. Oh, you weren't obvious, she said with a soft laugh. But I noticed things. Aurora's grip tightened slightly around her glass. I'm sure you do. A brief silence settled between them. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying Aurora with a look that felt too intentional. You look beautiful tonight, she said. Aurora nodded. Thank you. Another pause. Then, Olivia leaned in just slightly. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to shift the air. Hey, cousin. Aurora's breath slowed. Don't you think your wife and my fiancé are getting a little too familiar? The words were soft, almost playful, but they landed hard. Aurora's chest tightened instantly.
Her throat dry.
She coughed lightly. A reflex. A cover. I think you're imagining things, she replied, her tone carefully neutral. Olivia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Am I? Aurora held her gaze.
Steady.
Yes. Another silence. This one, sharper. Because now, they were no longer pretending. Olivia's expression softened again suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. I mean, it would be strange, wouldn't it? She continued lightly. You barely know him.
Barely.
Aurora forced herself to nod. Exactly. But Olivia didn't move away. Instead, she stepped closer. Even closer this time. Close enough that her voice dropped. I don't share well, Aurora. The words were quiet.
Calm. Certain.
Aurora felt something cold settle in her chest. Olivia's smile returned.
Bright. Charming.
Completely at odds with what she had just said. Not that there's anything to share, she added sweetly. Of course. Of course. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly. Of course, she echoed. A beat. Then, Olivia reached out, adjusting a small detail on Aurora's dress. An unnecessary gesture. Too familiar. Too controlled. You've always been good at getting attention, she said casually. Aurora's eyes flickered slightly. But this time, Olivia continued, her tone still light, I'd appreciate it if you didn't. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. A warning. Aurora inhaled slowly. I'm not interested in your fiancé, she said, her voice steady. Olivia held her gaze, searching, measuring.
Then,
she smiled again. I'm glad to hear that. A pause. Because neither of them fully believed it. Enjoy your night, Olivia added, stepping back slightly. Like nothing had happened. Like the conversation hadn't just shifted everything. Aurora nodded once. You too. And then, she turned.
because she needed to.
Needed space. Needed distance. Needed to breathe. Her steps were calm, controlled. But her heart was racing. Because this wasn't just tension anymore. It wasn't just memory. It was something else. Something dangerous. Something that could no longer stay hidden for long. Aurora moved toward the exit, her chest tight, her thoughts loud. And as she reached the door, she felt it again. That pull. She turned. Just once. And there he was. Matthew. Watching her. Not confused. Not distant. Aware. Like he understood exactly what had just happened. Even without hearing a word. Aurora held his gaze for a second longer than she should have. Then, she looked away and walked out. Because no matter how much she tried to deny it, this wasn't over. It was only getting harder to control. Chapter 16. Cracks in Marriage. Marriage, Aurora realized, wasn't loud when it started to fail. It was quiet. So quiet, you almost didn't notice it happening. The house was too big.
Too silent.
Too empty. Aurora stood by the window, her arms folded lightly across her chest as she stared out into the endless stretch of the Davenport estate. Perfect lawns. Still fountains. Nothing out of place. Just like her life. Or at least, how it looked. Behind her, the room remained untouched. The bed neatly made. The space beside it, cold. Alexander hadn't slept there. Again. Aurora didn't ask anymore. At first she had. Soft questions. Careful curiosity. Are you working late? Will you be back tonight? But his answers were always the same. Busy. Don't wait up. Meetings. And eventually,
She stopped asking.
because she already knew, this wasn't a marriage. It was an arrangement. And arrangements didn't require presence. They required appearance. Aurora exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the glass. Cold. Just like everything else. Days passed like this. Breakfast alone. Dinner alone. Conversations reduced to necessity. You'll attend the dinner on Thursday. Be ready by 8. Wear something formal. Instructions. Not interactions. Aurora followed them.
Of course she did.
But something inside her was starting to resist. Not loudly. Not rebelliously. But quietly. Like a thought she couldn't ignore anymore. Is this really my life? The question lingered longer each day. Growing heavier. Harder to silence. That evening, Aurora sat at the dining table alone, her food barely touched. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Each second stretching into something unbearable. She picked up her glass. Set it down again. Her mind wasn't here. It hadn't been. For a while. Because no matter how much she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Matthew. His voice. His eyes. The way everything between them still felt unfinished. Aurora closed her eyes briefly. No, she whispered to herself. She wouldn't go there. She couldn't. Not with everything already so fragile. A sudden sound broke the silence. Laughter.
Soft.
Distant. Aurora frowned slightly. It wasn't coming from inside. It was outside. She stood slowly, curiosity pulling her toward the sound despite herself. Step by step, she moved toward the corridor that led to the private wing. The voice grew clearer. Feminine.
Light.
Playful. Aurora slowed.
Because she recognized it.
Olivia. Her brows drew together. What was Olivia doing here? Aurora moved closer, her steps quieter now. "You're impossible." Olivia's voice came again, softer this time. Aurora stopped just before the corner. She hadn't meant to listen, but something about the tone made her stay. "You didn't seem to mind earlier." A man's voice.
Low.
Smooth. Aurora's heart skipped. She couldn't see them, not from where she stood, but she could hear them, and something about it felt wrong. "You know I always mind," Olivia replied, her voice dropping slightly. "But I never stop you." A soft laugh followed.
Close.
Intimate. Aurora's chest tightened. This wasn't casual conversation. "You're dangerous," the man said. "And you like that," Olivia answered easily. A pause. Then, "Come closer." The words were barely above a whisper. Aurora's breath caught. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. This wasn't meant for her to hear. But her feet refused to move. "You're going to get us caught," the man murmured. Olivia laughed softly. "No one's paying attention." Aurora's fingers curled slightly at her side. Something wasn't right. Something felt too familiar, too close. But before she could think further, footsteps approaching. Aurora stepped back quickly, her heart racing now. She turned, just as Olivia rounded the corner. Their eyes met instantly. Aurora froze. Olivia blinked once, then smiled.
Perfect. Composed.
As if nothing had happened. "Aurora," she said lightly. "I didn't know you were here." Aurora forced herself to breathe. "I could say the same." A beat. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying her. "Just needed some air," she added casually. The same excuse. Aurora nodded slowly. "Of course." Silence lingered between them, but this time, it felt heavier, because Aurora knew what she heard. And Olivia knew. She had heard something. "Good night, Aurora," Olivia said sweetly. And just like that, she walked past her, like nothing had happened, like there was nothing to question. Aurora stood still for a long moment. Then, slowly, she turned. But the corridor behind Olivia was empty. The man,
gone.
As if he had never been there. Aurora's chest felt tight again. Confusion. Suspicion. Something she couldn't quite name. But one thing was clear. Nothing was as it seemed. Not her marriage. Not Olivia. Not this life she had stepped into. Aurora exhaled slowly, her mind racing. "What am I doing here?" The question came again. Louder this time. Because for the first time, since she said "I do," she wasn't just surviving it. She was questioning it.
Deeply.
Dangerously. And she didn't know where that would lead her. Chapter 17. The first private encounter. Aurora had convinced herself it wouldn't happen again. After the wedding. After the reception. After everything that had already felt dangerously out of control, she had drawn a line in her mind. Clear, firm, necessary. She would avoid him. No lingering glances. No conversations. No moments that could be misinterpreted or, worse, remembered too clearly. It was the only way to survive this. And for a few days she had managed it. Or, at least she had tried. The charity event that evening was quieter than the last gathering they had both attended. Smaller, more exclusive, filled with familiar faces and restrained conversations. There were no grand distractions here, no overwhelming crowd to hide behind, no noise to drown out awareness, which made it far more dangerous. Aurora stepped into the hall with her usual composure, her posture straight, her expression carefully arranged into something polite and unreadable. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off polished floors, and conversations drifted in low, measured tones. It was the kind of environment she knew how to navigate effortlessly. And yet, something about it unsettled her. She could feel it almost immediately. That quiet shift in the air, the subtle awareness that made her senses sharpen without warning. As if she already knew. She didn't need to search for him. And still she did. Her gaze moved across the room, slow and controlled, until it found him. Matthew. He stood near the far end, engaged in conversation, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakable. Anyone else might have blended into the elegance of the room, but not him. Not to her. And, as if he had felt her looking, he turned. Their eyes met. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Aurora looked away immediately, her breath catching just slightly as she forced herself to move forward. She couldn't stand there. Couldn't allow the moment to settle into something more. Not here. Not again. She adjusted her grip on her clutch and changed direction, moving toward one of the quieter corridors that led away from the main hall. Her steps were steady, but faster than usual, her mind already racing ahead of her. This was a mistake. Being here, knowing he might be here, had been a mistake. She needed space. Just a few minutes to breathe, to gather herself, to push everything back down where it belonged. The corridor was dimmer, quieter, the noise from the hall fading into a distant hum. Aurora exhaled slowly as she walked, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. And then, Aurora. His voice came from behind her, calm and unmistakable. She stopped.
Not because she wanted to,
but because she couldn't keep pretending she hadn't heard him. For a moment, she didn't turn. She simply stood there, her back to him, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. "You shouldn't follow me," she said, her voice controlled, though softer than she intended. There was a brief pause before he responded. "I wasn't going to," he said, "but you stopped." Aurora closed her eyes for the briefest second, a quiet frustration settling in her chest. He wasn't wrong, and that only made it worse. Slowly, she turned. He was closer than she expected. Not too close, not enough to draw attention, but close enough that the space between them felt deliberate. Matthew looked exactly the same. Composed. Focused. Watching her in that way that made it difficult to hide anything at all. "You're avoiding me," he said, his tone calm, almost observational. Aurora let out a quiet breath. "I'm being careful." "With me?" "With everything," she replied. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her answer, then took a small step closer. Not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to shift the tension between them. "You think ignoring it is going to make it go away?" Her chest tightened. "I think pretending it didn't happen is the only way this doesn't become a problem." "And is that what you're doing?" he asked. "Pretending." Aurora met his gaze then, fully, and for a second, her composure slipped. "It shouldn't have happened," she said. The words were firm, but not entirely convincing, not even to her own ears. Matthew didn't look away. "Look at me and say that like you mean it." A silence fell between them, heavy and unrelenting. Aurora held his gaze, her heart beating harder now, her thoughts pulling in opposite directions. She should end this. She should say it clearly, shut it down, walk away, and never let it reach this point again. But the truth sat too close to the surface.
and he could see it.
"That night wasn't nothing," he said quietly. Aurora's breath caught. She looked away just for a moment, because hearing it out loud made it harder to deny. "You're engaged," she said instead, her voice steadier now. "To Olivia." "And you're married," he replied. The words settled between them, undeniable and sharp. Aurora nodded faintly. "Exactly. It should have been enough. It should have ended the conversation." But neither of them moved. Neither of them stepped back, because something in the space between them refused to let it go. "You felt it too," Matthew said, more quietly now. Aurora shook her head instinctively, even as her chest tightened. "Stop. Then tell me I'm wrong." She couldn't, and they both knew it. Aurora exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, trying to find the version of herself that always knew what to say, how to respond, how to stay in control. "This can't happen," she said finally. Matthew's gaze didn't waver. "It already has." Her pulse quickened. "Matthew, tell me to walk away," he said. The simplicity of it caught her off guard. There was no pressure in his tone. No demand. Just a quiet certainty. "If you tell me to walk away," he continued, "I will." Aurora stared at him, because she knew he meant it. And that was exactly what made it so hard. All she had to do was say the words. End it. Create distance. Protect what little control she had left. But something inside her resisted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to stop her from doing what she knew she should. The silence stretched, fragile and tense. "Say it," he said softly. Aurora's lips parted slightly, her breath uneven as the weight of the moment pressed in on her. She should. She needed to. But instead, I can't. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Quiet. Barely there.
But honest.
For a second, neither of them moved. Something shifted in Matthew's expression. Not surprise, not satisfaction, but something deeper. Something that made the moment feel even more dangerous than before. Because now there was no pretending. Aurora stepped back abruptly, breaking whatever had just formed between them. We shouldn't be doing this, she said quickly, her voice more controlled now, though her heart was anything but. Matthew didn't follow her this time. But he didn't look away either. We won't be able to keep pretending, he said. Aurora paused, her back to him once again. I know. And that was the problem. She walked away before she could say anything else, before she could turn back, before she could undo the fragile distance she had just tried to rebuild. Her steps were steady, but her thoughts weren't. Because the truth was no longer something she could ignore. They hadn't crossed the line. Not yet. But they had come close enough to know. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 18. The Secret That Breathes. Aurora didn't tell anyone she was leaving. Not Alexander.
Not the staff.
Not even herself, at least, not in a way that allowed doubt to settle in. She simply woke up that morning with a decision already made. And for once, she followed it. The drive felt longer than she remembered. Or maybe it only felt that way because her heart hadn't stopped racing since she stepped into the car. Every passing street, every turn, every familiar landmark stirred something inside her, something she had spent years trying to quiet.
Guilt.
Longing. A kind of ache that never really left, no matter how deeply she buried it. When the car finally slowed to a stop, Aurora didn't move immediately. She sat there, her fingers curled tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the modest house just ahead. It was quiet, peaceful, unremarkable in every way. And yet, everything that mattered to her was inside it. Madam, the driver prompted gently. Aurora nodded faintly, pulling herself out of her thoughts. I'll go in alone, she said. He didn't question her. He never did. The walk to the door felt heavier than it should have. Not because she didn't want to be there, but because she wanted it too much. She knocked softly. Once. Twice. And then the door opened. Aurora. The voice was warm. Familiar. Aurora managed a small smile. Hello, Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell stepped aside immediately, letting her in without another word. Her eyes lingered for a moment, gentle, observant, but she asked no questions. She never did. The house smelled faintly of something sweet. Warm. Lived in. It didn't feel like the world Aurora belonged to anymore. And yet, it felt more like home than anywhere else. Is he? Aurora began, her voice quieter now. In the sitting room, Mrs. Hartwell replied softly. Aurora didn't wait. Her steps quickened, her breath catching slightly as she moved down the short hallway. And then, she saw him. Alvin. He sat on the floor, small toys scattered around him, completely absorbed in his own little world. For a moment, Aurora just stood there, taking him in. He had grown. Of course he had. But the realization still hit her harder than she expected. His hair, his posture, the way he moved. Time had not waited for her. Alvin, her voice was barely above a whisper. The little boy looked up. For a second, there was confusion in his eyes. A pause. A moment of uncertainty. And then, recognition. Mummy. The word broke something inside her. Aurora dropped to her knees before she even realized she was moving, pulling him into her arms as tightly as she could. I'm here, she whispered, her voice trembling now. I'm here. He wrapped his small arms around her, without hesitation, like no time had passed, like nothing had changed. And maybe, for him, nothing had. Aurora held him longer than she intended, longer than she should have, because in that moment, everything else disappeared. The marriage, the expectations, the lies. None of it mattered. Only this did. Only him. She pulled back slightly, her hands gently holding his face as she looked at him. Really looked. I missed you, she said softly. Alvin smiled. Simple.
Bright.
I missed you too. The words were easy for him. Uncomplicated. Aurora felt her throat tighten. How have you been? She asked, brushing her thumb lightly against his cheek. I've been good, he said proudly. Mrs. Hartwell lets me watch cartoons after I eat. Aurora laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar and yet deeply comforting. Does she now? Alvin nodded eagerly, already reaching for her hand. Come and see. Aurora let him lead her. She sat on the floor beside him, her dress forgotten, her world shrinking down to something smaller and infinitely more meaningful.
He talked.
Endlessly. About everything and nothing. And she listened. Not as Aurora Kinsley. Not as a wife. Not as a daughter bound by expectation. But as a mother. Fully.
Completely.
Time passed without her noticing. Until reality, quietly, began to return. It started with a glance at the clock, then the fading light outside, then the slow, heavy awareness settling back into her chest. She couldn't stay. She never could. Aurora looked at Alvin, still smiling, still unaware of everything she was about to leave behind again. I have to go soon, she said gently. His expression changed instantly.
Why?
The question was simple, but it cut deeper than anything else. Aurora swallowed. I'll come back, she said instead. Not an answer, but the only one she could give. Alvin studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Trust. Just like that. Aurora pulled him into another embrace, holding him tightly, as if trying to make up for all the time she had missed. I love you, she whispered into his hair. I love you too, he replied. And just like that,
she had to let go.
The goodbye was the hardest part. It always was. Aurora walked back toward the door slowly, each step heavier than the last. Mrs. Hartwell stood nearby, watching quietly. Thank you, Aurora said softly. Mrs. Hartwell gave a small nod. You're always welcome. But they both knew. It wasn't that simple. Aurora stepped outside, the evening air brushing gently against her skin. And just like that, the world she belonged to returned. Cold, controlled, unforgiving. She paused before getting into the car, her gaze lingering on the house one last time. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. She wasn't just living a lie. She was protecting one. And if it ever came to light, everything would fall apart. Chapter 19. Suspicion begins. Olivia had always trusted her instincts. Not blindly, not impulsively, but carefully, like someone who had learned, over time, that people rarely said everything they meant and almost never hid everything successfully. Something was off. She noticed it first in the smallest moments, the kind most people would overlook. A glance that lasted a second too long. A silence where there should have been ease. A shift in energy that didn't match the conversation. At first, she ignored it, because it didn't make sense. Aurora was married. Matthew was with her. Everything was exactly where it should be. And yet,
it didn't feel that way.
The afternoon sun filtered softly through the cafe windows as Olivia stirred her drink absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. Across from her, Matthew sat quietly, his attention on his phone. Or at least, that's what it looked like. You've been distracted lately. The words came out lightly.
Casually.
Matthew didn't look up immediately. Have I? Olivia smiled faintly. You tell me. He set his phone down then, finally meeting her gaze.
Come.
Steady. Unrevealing. I've just been busy, he said. There it was again. That answer.
Neat.
Simple. Useless. Olivia nodded slowly, as if accepting it. But her eyes didn't leave his. Busy enough to forget I'm sitting right in front of you? She asked, her tone still soft, but sharper now beneath the surface. Matthew leaned back slightly, studying her for a moment. I'm here, aren't I? Yes, Olivia replied. Physically. A brief silence settled between them. Not tense. Not yet. But not comfortable either. Olivia broke eye contact first, reaching for her drink, her movements unhurried, controlled. "You know," she continued, almost thoughtfully, "I saw you at the reception." Matthew didn't react. Not visibly. With Aurora. There it was. A test. Still, nothing obvious changed in his expression. "We were introduced," he said simply. Olivia smiled faintly.
Yes.
"You were." Another pause. "But introductions don't usually come with that kind of silence," she added. Matthew's gaze sharpened slightly. "What kind of silence?" Olivia met his eyes again. "The kind where people are trying not to say something." The words hung between them.
Light.
But deliberate. Matthew didn't answer immediately. And that told her more than anything else. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her expression softening again, as if the moment hadn't mattered. "Maybe I'm overthinking," she said with a small shrug. Maybe. But she didn't believe that. Because Olivia didn't overthink.
She observed.
And she remembered. Later that evening, she found herself alone in her room, her heels abandoned near the door, her phone resting loosely in her hand. The silence around her was different from Aurora's. Not empty.
Not lonely.
Focused. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, her mind replaying moments she hadn't paid attention to before. The way Aurora had looked at him. The way he had looked back.
Subtle.
Careful. But not invisible. "No," she murmured softly. Because now that she had seen it, she couldn't unsee it. And once Olivia noticed something,
she didn't let it go.
Her fingers tapped lightly against her phone as her thoughts began to shift. From observation to intention. If there was something there, she would find it. Not by asking. Not directly. But by watching. Closely. A slow smile curved her lips. Because this was something she understood.
People.
Secrets. The space between what was shown and what was hidden. And Aurora. Sweet, composed Aurora. Was hiding something. Olivia was sure of it now. The question was, how much? She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as her thoughts settled into something clearer. More focused. "I'll find out," she whispered. Not out of curiosity, but certainty. Because whatever it was, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Chapter 20. A Dangerous Dinner. The invitation had come 2 days earlier.
Short.
Polite. Impossible to refuse. Dinner this Friday. Just the 4 of us. It's time we spent more time together. Olivia. Aurora had read it more than once. Not because the message was unclear, but because the intention behind it wasn't. Is something wrong? Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts that evening as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a pair of earrings she hadn't chosen herself. Aurora met his reflection briefly.
No.
A pause. "You've been distracted," he said. She almost smiled. "You've been absent," she replied calmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, his expression unchanged. "Tonight requires focus," he said. Of course it did. Aurora turned back to the mirror, smoothing her dress. "Then we should both be prepared," she said. That was the end of it. The drive to Olivia's place was quiet. Not uncomfortable. Just empty. Aurora sat beside Alexander, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her mind already preparing for what the evening might bring. Because she knew Olivia. And Olivia didn't do anything without a reason. The house was warm when they arrived. Inviting. Carefully arranged. Olivia greeted them at the door with a smile that felt just a little too bright. "Aurora," she said warmly, leaning in for a brief embrace. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Aurora replied, matching her tone. "And Alexander," Olivia added, turning to him with equal ease. "Always a pleasure." "Likewise," he said smoothly. Everything was as it should be. And yet, it wasn't. Matthew appeared moments later.
Calm. Composed.
Unavoidable. Aurora felt it immediately. That shift. That awareness. But this time, she didn't look at him first. She had learned. "Good to see you again," he said, his tone neutral. Aurora nodded slightly. "You too." Strangers. That was what they were supposed to be.
And for now,
they played the part well. Dinner began simply enough. Polite conversation, measured laughter, carefully chosen topics,
Work. Travel.
shared acquaintances. Everything safe, everything controlled. But beneath it, something else moved. Aurora felt it in the pauses, in the way Olivia watched, in the way Matthew spoke just a little too carefully, and in the way Alexander said very little at all. You and Aurora haven't spent much time together, Olivia said suddenly, her tone light as she glanced between the two men. Aurora's grip tightened slightly around her glass. Not really, Matthew replied. Strange, Olivia continued, tilting her head slightly. Considering how often your circles overlap. Aurora forced a small smile. I suppose we've just never had the opportunity, she said.
A lie.
But a necessary one. Olivia's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than expected. Opportunities have a way of presenting themselves, she said softly. Aurora held her gaze. Only if you're looking for them. A beat. Something flickered between them. Then Olivia smiled again. True. The conversation moved on. But the tension didn't. It lingered. Subtle. Persistent. Like something just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. At one point, Aurora reached for her glass at the same time Matthew did. Their fingers brushed. It lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Aurora pulled her hand back immediately. Too quickly. And she knew. Someone had noticed. She didn't look up. Didn't need to. The silence that followed was brief. But different. Oh, sorry, she said lightly. It's fine, Matthew replied. Normal. Casual. But not convincing. Aurora could feel Olivia's gaze now. Sharp. Focused. Watching. Always watching. And how is married life? Olivia asked suddenly, her attention shifting to Aurora again. The question was simple, but the timing wasn't. Aurora paused for just a fraction of a second, then smiled. It's an adjustment. Alexander glanced at her briefly. That's one way to put it, he said. Aurora turned to him slightly. And what would you call it? A beat. Alexander met her gaze. Functional. The word settled heavily on the table. Too honest. Too revealing. Olivia laughed lightly, breaking the tension. Well, at least you're both honest, she said. Aurora didn't respond, because honesty was the one thing none of them were truly offering. Dinner continued, but the ease never returned. Every glance felt measured. Every word felt deliberate. And every silence felt louder than it should. By the time dessert was served, Aurora felt it clearly. The shift. The unease. Not just hers. Everyone's. Something had changed. Something had been noticed. And no one was saying it out loud. As they stood to leave, Olivia walked them to the door, her smile perfectly in place. We should do this again, she said. Aurora nodded. Yes, she replied. But her voice felt distant. Because she knew the next time wouldn't be this quiet. The next time, someone would say something. And when they did, everything would change. Chapter 21. Alexander changes. At first, it was easy to ignore. The distance had always been there. From the beginning. So when Alexander spoke less, stayed out longer, or barely looked at her during meals, Aurora told herself it wasn't new. It was simply consistent. But then, it changed. Not louder. Not obvious. Just different enough to feel it. Aurora noticed it one evening when she entered the study without knocking. A habit she had formed over time. Quiet, careful, never wanting to intrude, but never expecting resistance either. Alexander was on the phone, his voice low, measured. He stopped the moment he saw her. Not paused. Not delayed. Stopped. I'll call you back, he said, ending the conversation immediately. Aurora hesitated at the door. I didn't realize you were busy. You should knock, he replied. The words were calm, but they landed differently. Aurora blinked slightly. I usually don't need to. A pause. Alexander held her gaze. You should start. Silence settled between them. Not loud. Not aggressive. But firm. Aurora nodded once. Noted. She turned to leave. Why were you here? He asked. She paused again, glancing back. I was going to ask if you'd be home for dinner. I won't. Of course. Aurora gave a small nod. Then I won't wait. She stepped out of the room before he could respond. But the feeling followed her. That shift. Something had changed. And this time, it wasn't just distance. It was awareness. The days that followed only confirmed it. Alexander was still composed, still controlled, still the same man the world saw. But with her, there was something else. A sharpness. A quiet scrutiny. He watched more, spoke less. And when he did speak, it felt intentional. Where were you this afternoon? The question came casually, over breakfast. Aurora didn't look up immediately. At home. A pause. You didn't leave? She met his gaze then.
No.
Another pause. Too long.
Then, all right.
Just one word. But it lingered. Because it didn't feel like belief. It felt like something else. Something closer to doubt. Aurora pushed her plate away slightly, her appetite fading. Is there something you want to ask me? She said calmly. Alexander leaned back in his chair.
No. A lie.
She could hear it, but she didn't push. Because pushing would mean confrontation. And confrontation would mean truth. Neither of them seemed ready for that. Later that evening, Aurora stood in their bedroom, adjusting the sleeve of her dress as she prepared to go out. Alone. Again. She had stopped asking him to join her. Stopped expecting it. The door opened behind her. Aurora glanced at the mirror. Alexander stood there, watching her. You're going somewhere. Not a question. Yes. Where? Aurora turned slowly. A gallery opening. He nodded once. With who? The question came too quickly. Too directly. Aurora held his gaze. Does it matter? A beat. Yes. The answer was immediate. And that was new. Aurora studied him carefully. Since when? Alexander didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his expression unreadable. Since I realized I don't know as much about my wife as I should. The words were smooth, controlled, but underneath, there was something else. Something colder. Aurora felt it settle in her chest. You've never seemed interested before, she said quietly. Another pause. People change. Aurora let out a soft breath. Yes, she said. They do. Silence stretched between them again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with things neither of them were saying. Suspicion, distance, unspoken questions. Aurora turned back to the mirror, finishing what she had started. I won't be late, she added. Alexander didn't respond, but she could still feel his gaze on her. Heavy, lingering, and, for the first time, unsettling. That night, as Aurora lay in bed alone, sleep felt distant. Her mind replayed every moment, every look, every shift in tone. Something was changing, not just in him, in everything, and she didn't know where it would lead. But she knew one thing for certain. The distance between them wasn't just growing. It was turning into something else. Something sharper. Something that could no longer be ignored. Chapter 22. Matthew's Doubt. Matthew had always trusted what he could see.
Facts.
Actions. Patterns. He wasn't someone who read too deeply into things without reason. He preferred clarity, something solid, something he could define and understand. But Aurora was none of those things. She didn't make sense. Not completely. At first, it had been simple.
A night.
A connection. Something unexpected that neither of them had planned for. Then she disappeared. And he had told himself that was the end of it. Until it wasn't. Matthew stood by the window of his apartment, his phone resting loosely in his hand as he stared out at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, steady and predictable. Unlike his thoughts, he had seen her again. Not once. Not twice. But enough times now that it stopped feeling like coincidence. And every time, it felt the same. That pull. That recognition. That unfinished something neither of them seemed able to ignore. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was everything else. The way she spoke. Carefully. Like every word had to pass through a filter before it reached him. the way she avoided certain topics, deflected questions without making it obvious, and most of all, the way she looked at him sometimes, not just with memory, not just with feeling, but with something heavier, something guarded, something afraid. Matthew frowned slightly, his grip tightening around his phone. What was she hiding? The question had been there before. Quiet, easy to ignore.
Now.
It wasn't, because it didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like concealment, and there was a difference, a sharp one. His mind drifted back to the dinner, the tension, the careful exchanges, the moment their hands had brushed. Too quick, too reactive. Not just awareness, but caution, like she had something to lose. Matthew exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he turned away from the window. Of course, she had something to lose. She was married, but this felt like more than that, because marriage explained distance. It explained restraint. It didn't explain the weight he saw in her eyes, or the way she hesitated, as if every step she took had consequences he couldn't see. He crossed the room slowly, his thoughts sharpening now, forming into something more structured. If there was something she wasn't saying, then there was something he didn't know. And he didn't like that, not because he needed control, but because he needed clarity. His phone buzzed lightly in his hand. Olivia. He stared at the screen for a second before answering. Hey. Hi. Olivia replied, her voice warm, familiar. I was wondering if you were still coming tomorrow. Matthew leaned against the counter, his expression neutral. I am. Good, she said. You've been distant lately. There it was again. That word.
Distant.
I've just been busy, he replied. A pause. Matthew. His name, softer this time. More deliberate. He closed his eyes briefly. I said I'd be there, he added. Another silence. Then, all right. But she didn't sound convinced. The call ended shortly after. Matthew set his phone down, his jaw tightening slightly. Everything felt like it was shifting. From every direction. Olivia was watching him. Aurora was hiding something. And he was standing somewhere in the middle, without enough answers. He didn't like that position. Not at all. Matthew pushed himself away from the counter, pacing slowly across the room. He could ignore it, pretend none of it mattered, focus on what was already in front of him. But that wasn't who he was. And more importantly, it wasn't possible, because Aurora was no longer just a memory. She was a question. And Matthew had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. He stopped walking, his gaze settling into something more focused now. More certain. If there was something she wasn't telling him, he would find out. Not carelessly, not recklessly, but deliberately. Because whatever it was, it mattered. And whether she wanted him to know or not, he was no longer willing to stay in the dark. Chapter 23. Almost caught. Matthew hadn't planned to follow her. That was the truth he told himself as he sat in his car, parked just far enough from the entrance of the gallery to avoid attention. He had been there for something else entirely. A meeting that ended earlier than expected. A conversation that didn't hold his focus. A day that felt slightly off, though he couldn't quite explain why. And then, he saw her. Aurora stepped out of the building with a kind of quiet urgency he hadn't seen before. No hesitation. No lingering conversation. Just movement. It caught his attention immediately. Not because she was leaving, but because of how she was leaving. She looked careful. Her gaze moved briefly around her surroundings, not nervously, but deliberately, as if ensuring something, or someone, wasn't there. Matthew frowned slightly. That feeling returned. The same one that had been building for days now. Something isn't right. He should have looked away. Should have let it go. But he didn't. Instead, he waited. Watched. Aurora got into her car quickly, speaking briefly to the driver before the vehicle pulled away. Matthew's fingers tapped once against the steering wheel. A decision. Quick. Unplanned. Then he started his engine. The drive wasn't long, but it was far enough from the city center to raise questions. Matthew kept a safe distance, careful not to draw attention, his focus sharp as he followed the path her car took. Street after street, turn after turn, until eventually, The car slowed. Matthew's brows drew together slightly as he glanced at the surroundings. A school. Children moved in small groups near the entrance, laughter and chatter filling the air in a way that felt almost out of place compared to everything else he had been thinking. Aurora's car came to a stop. Matthew parked a short distance away, his gaze fixed as he watched her step out. There it was again. That shift. She looked different here. Less guarded. Less composed. Still careful, but not in the same way. She walked toward the entrance, her steps steady but purposeful. Matthew stepped out of his car without fully thinking it through, keeping enough distance as he moved closer, blending into the background just enough not to be noticed. His mind was already working ahead of him. Why is she here? Aurora wasn't the type to visit places without reason. Everything about her was intentional, which meant this was too. He slowed his steps as she approached a small group of children being dismissed by a teacher. Matthew's attention sharpened. And then,
He saw it.
Aurora smiled. Not the polite, measured smile she wore in public settings. Not the one she used at dinners or events. This one was different.
Softer.
Warmer.
Real.
Matthew felt something shift in his chest. Because he had never seen that version of her before. And it didn't match anything he thought he knew. Aurora bent slightly, speaking to one of the teachers, her posture relaxed in a way that felt natural. Like she belonged there. Matthew took a small step closer, his focus narrowing. And then, a child ran past him, laughing.
Fast.
Unpredictable. Matthew instinctively stepped back to avoid bumping into him, his attention breaking for just a second. Just 1 second. But it was enough. By the time he looked up again, Aurora had moved. She was no longer near the teacher. Instead, she stood a few steps away, her back partially turned, her body slightly lowered as if she were speaking to someone smaller. Someone he couldn't fully see. Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly, his instinct sharpening.
Who was she talking to?
He shifted his position subtly, trying to get a clearer view. Just a little closer. But before he could, a voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir?" Matthew turned slightly. "A staff member." "You can't stand here," the woman said politely. "Parents usually wait outside the gate." Matthew nodded quickly, stepping back without argument. "Of course," he replied. It took less than a moment. But by the time he turned back again, Aurora was walking away. And she wasn't alone. His eyes followed her immediately. A child walked beside her. Small. Young. But positioned just far enough. Angled just enough. That Matthew couldn't see his face. Aurora reached for the child's hand. And something about that made Matthew go completely still. It wasn't the gesture. It was how natural it looked. How instinctive. How familiar. Like she had done it 1,000 times before. Matthew's mind tried to piece it together. A relative? A family friend? But it didn't sit right. Because the version of Aurora he knew, the one she showed the world, didn't include this. Didn't explain this. Aurora opened the car door, helping the child inside before walking around to the other side. Matthew took a step forward instinctively.
He needed to see.
Just one clear look. Just one moment. But the car door shut. The engine started. And within seconds, they were gone. Matthew stood there, his jaw tightening slightly as the car disappeared from view. Too fast. Too incomplete. But not meaningless. Because even without seeing everything, he had seen enough. Enough to know. This wasn't nothing. This wasn't coincidence. This was something real. Something hidden. Matthew exhaled slowly, his mind already racing ahead, replaying every second, every detail, every movement. Aurora at a school. Aurora smiling like that. Aurora with a child. His gaze darkened slightly.
No.
There was more to this. There had to be.
And now, he was certain of it.
Matthew turned back toward his car, his thoughts sharper, more focused than they had been before. Whatever she was hiding, he had just come dangerously close to finding it. And next time, he wouldn't miss. Chapter 24. Olivia's Game. Olivia did not believe in coincidence. Not when it came to people. Not when it came to patterns. And certainly not when it came to behavior that didn't align. By the time she decided to visit Alexander, she had already thought it through. Every word, every pause, every reaction she intended to provoke. She didn't need proof. Not yet. All she needed was doubt. The house was quiet when she arrived. Predictably so. Alexander preferred silence, order, control. It was one of the many things she understood about him. She didn't wait to be announced. She never did. The study door was slightly ajar when she reached it. She pushed it open gently, stepping inside without hesitation. Alexander looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable for a brief second before settling into something more neutral. "Olivia. Am I interrupting?" she asked, though she was already walking in. "No," he replied, closing the file in front of him. "You're not." She smiled faintly and took a seat across from him, crossing her legs with effortless composure. "I was nearby," she said. "I thought I'd check on you." Alexander studied her for a moment, as if weighing the simplicity of her statement against the certainty that there was more behind it. "There usually is a reason when you check on me," he said calmly. Olivia's smile deepened slightly. "You know me well." A pause settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It never was. That was the first sign. The ease. "I wanted to ask you something," she said finally, her tone softening just enough to seem thoughtful rather than deliberate. Alexander leaned back, slightly in his chair. "Go on." Olivia let a brief silence pass, as though she were choosing her words carefully. "Have you noticed anything different about Aurora lately?" There it was. Not direct. Not confrontational. Just enough. Alexander's expression didn't change immediately, but his gaze sharpened. "In what way?" Olivia lowered her eyes briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the arm of the chair. "I don't know if I'm reading too much into it," she said quietly. "But sometimes the way she interacts with Matthew feels unusual." Alexander didn't speak. So she continued. "Not inappropriate," she added quickly. "Just familiar. More than it should be, considering how little they're supposed to know each other." The room grew still. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Olivia noticed.
Of course she did.
"I might be wrong," she said, leaning back again, her tone lightening. "It's just something I picked up on. A feeling more than anything." Silence followed. And this time, it wasn't empty. "I've noticed it too." The words came from Alexander, without hesitation. Olivia looked at him then, slowly. "Really?" He nodded once. "She's been distant," he said. "Careful. Like she's measuring everything she says." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "And that doesn't concern you?" Another pause. "It does now," he replied. There it was. The shift. Olivia felt it settle into place, quiet and precise. She didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch again, letting his thoughts deepen, letting the doubt grow roots. "You should trust your instincts," she said softly. "They're usually right." Alexander's gaze held hers. Longer this time, and something in the air changed. Subtle, but undeniable. The conversation had served its purpose. Now, they were left with what came after. Olivia stood slowly, as if preparing to leave, but she didn't move toward the door. Instead, she lingered. "Be careful, Alexander," she said quietly. "Sometimes the things we assume are stable aren't." He didn't respond immediately. He was watching her now, as something else. "Since when do you concern yourself with my marriage?" he asked. Olivia's lips curved slightly. "Since I realized it might affect more than just you." A beat passed between them. Then another. Neither of them moved. And then, she stepped closer. Not abruptly. Not hesitantly. Naturally. As if the distance between them had never truly existed. Alexander didn't stop her. He never did. "You've changed," he said quietly. Olivia tilted her head, her gaze holding his. "Have I?" "You're more involved." Her smile softened, but there was something sharper beneath it. "Maybe I've always been involved," she said. Another step closer. Now she stood just beside his desk, spreading her legs across him to reveal her splitted gown and exposing her legs. His hands moved fast between them, making her MAON and call out for him. Alexander stood slowly, his height closing the remaining distance between them. Neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. The silence carried history, unspoken, unacknowledged, but very much alive. Olivia's hand rested lightly against the edge of the desk, her gaze never leaving his. "You're letting it get to you," she said softly. "And you're not," he countered. Her smile deepened slightly. "I don't let things control me." A pause. Then, more quietly, "I control them." The words settled between them, heavy, intentional, and that was when the last boundary disappeared, with the quiet certainty of something that had existed long before this moment. Alexander's hand found her waist. Firm. Familiar. Olivia didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer. And then, whatever restraint remained,
Was gone.
the space between them disappeared completely, replaced by something charged. They kissed passionately, no hesitation. Only recognition of something they both understood too well. Too wrong. Too familiar. And still, neither of them stopped. "Can Matthew ever make you feel this way?" he asked, turning her over and laying her flat on the desk while he unzipped. Olivia enjoyed every bit of it as she moaned and laughed uncontrollably. When they finally pulled apart, the room felt different. Heavier. Not with guilt, but with consequence. Olivia straightened slightly, her composure returning almost instantly, as if nothing had happened. As if everything had. "You should watch her more closely," she said, her voice calm again. Controlled. Alexander didn't respond, but he didn't look away either, because now, he was already thinking differently, seeing differently, exactly as she intended. Olivia picked up her bag, her movements unhurried as she walked toward the door. And just before she stepped out, she paused. "You know I'm never wrong about people," she said without turning back. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. And inside the room, Alexander remained still, but not unchanged, because doubt had already taken hold, and Olivia had just made sure it would grow. Chapter 25. Emotional Breaking Point. Aurora had learned how to endure. It was something she had mastered over the years, quietly, without recognition, smiling when she needed to, speaking when expected, remaining composed, even when everything inside her felt like it was unraveling. But endurance had a limit, and she was reaching it. It started subtly, a look that lasted too long, a question that felt too deliberate, a silence that carried more meaning than words. Alexander had changed, not in a way that could be easily named, not in a way she could point to and confront, but she felt it, in the way his eyes lingered on her now, not with indifference, but with something sharper, in the way his questions came without warning, disguised as casual curiosity, but rooted in something deeper, in the way the air between them felt heavier, more watchful, as though every movement she made was being quietly observed. And Olivia. Aurora exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the dressing table as her reflection stared back at her. Olivia was no longer just present. She was involved. It was in the way she spoke, the way she smiled, the way her words carried meanings that lingered long after the conversation ended. Aurora didn't have proof, but she had instinct, and her instinct told her something was wrong. Very wrong. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself, but the thoughts didn't stop. They only grew louder. Matthew. That was the part she couldn't silence. The part that refused to stay buried. She had tried. She had done everything she could to keep distance, to maintain control, to remind herself of the life she was supposed to live. But every time she saw him, every time their paths crossed, it became harder. Because what they shared wasn't something she could dismiss anymore. And that was dangerous. Not just for her. For everyone. Aurora opened her eyes again, her reflection blurring slightly as her vision shifted. Her chest tightened. Too much. It was all too much. The lies. The pretending. The constant awareness that one wrong step could destroy everything. And beneath all of it, the one truth she could never afford to reveal. Alvin. Her breath caught. The thought of him, of his smile, his voice, the way he looked at her without doubt or expectation, cut through everything else with painful clarity. He was the only real thing in her life, the only part of her that wasn't built on obligation or secrecy. And he was the one thing she had to hide the most. Aurora pressed a hand against her chest, as if trying to steady the ache building inside it. How long could she keep doing this? How long could she live divided between two worlds, one built on truth, the other on illusion, without losing herself completely? The question didn't have an answer, because she already knew the truth. She was already losing herself. A soft, uneven breath escaped her lips, then another, and before she could stop it, the tears came, quiet at first, then unstoppable. Aurora sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, her composure slipping completely as everything she had been holding back finally broke through. There was no one to see it, no one to hear it, just her, and the weight of everything she carried. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely there. But the words didn't finish, because there was nothing else to say. No solution, no escape, only the truth she had been trying to outrun, that she was trapped, not just in her marriage, not just in her circumstances, but in the choices she had made. Aurora covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling as the silence of the room closed in around her. There was no comfort here, no reassurance, only space, too much space, and for the first time, it didn't feel like control. It felt like isolation, complete, unforgiving, alone. The words settled heavily in her chest, because that was what this had become. Not sacrifice,
Not duty.
loneliness. And no matter how hard she tried, there was no one she could turn to. Not her parents, not her husband, not even the one person she wished she could trust, because every connection in her life now came with a cost, and she was running out of strength to pay it. Aurora lay back slowly against the bed, staring up at the ceiling through blurred vision, her breathing uneven, her thoughts scattered and heavy. The house was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence, her reality finally settled in fully. She had never felt this alone, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure it. Chapter 26. The Child Revealed, almost. Matthew didn't believe in loose ends. If something didn't make sense, he followed it until it did. And Aurora still didn't make sense. He had tried to let it go, told himself it wasn't his place, that whatever she was hiding had nothing to do with him. But that had been before the school, before the child.
Now,
It was different. Matthew stood across the street, his gaze fixed on the same building he had seen days ago. The school. He hadn't planned to come back. At least, not immediately. But the image wouldn't leave him.
Aurora, smiling like that.
Reaching for a child's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. It didn't fit. And the more he thought about it, the less he could ignore it. So he came back. Not impulsively, not carelessly, but deliberately. He checked the time. Dismissal would start soon. Matthew leaned casually against his car, blending into the line of waiting parents and drivers, just enough to avoid attention. This time, he wasn't going to miss anything. Minutes passed. Children began to pour out in small groups, laughter filling the air, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping in chaotic harmony. Matthew's eyes scanned the crowd carefully, focused, patient. Then, he saw her. Aurora stepped out of the car again, her movements just as careful as before, but now Matthew was watching more closely. He noticed everything. The way she paused briefly before approaching the gate. The way her gaze swept the area, not nervously, but cautiously, like someone protecting something. Or someone. Matthew straightened slightly. There it is again. He moved subtly, adjusting his position to get a clearer view. Aurora spoke briefly to one of the staff members, her tone calm, familiar. Then she stepped aside, waiting. Matthew's focus sharpened. A few seconds passed, and then a small boy ran toward her. This time, Matthew saw clearly. The child. There was no mistaking it. The way Aurora's face changed. It wasn't polite. It wasn't controlled. It was real. She bent down immediately, her arms opening without hesitation as the boy reached her. "Mummy." The word carried across the distance.
Clear.
Unmistakable. Matthew froze. Everything around him seemed to fade for a moment. "Mummy." His jaw tightened slightly, his mind racing to catch up with what he had just heard. Aurora pulled the boy into her arms, holding him close in a way that spoke of familiarity, of routine, of something far deeper than coincidence. Not a relative, not a family friend. This was— Matthew exhaled slowly, his thoughts sharpening instantly. A child. Her child. The realization settled in quickly. Too quickly. Because now, everything else began to shift around it. The secrecy, the distance, the careful way she lived her life. It all started to make sense. But not completely. Because there was still one question. Why hide him? Matthew's gaze remained fixed on them as Aurora stood, taking the boy's hand gently. He studied the child more closely now. The features.
The age.
2, maybe 3 years old. His chest tightened slightly. The timing. Matthew's expression darkened.
No.
He shook the thought off almost immediately. That was too far. Too much of a stretch. It couldn't be. And yet, he didn't look away. Because something inside him refused to dismiss it entirely. Aurora led the boy toward the car, her movements natural, practiced. Like she had done this countless times before. Matthew watched every step, every gesture, every detail. And this time, nothing interrupted him. He saw it all. The way she adjusted the boy's jacket. The way she spoke to him softly before helping him into the car. The way her hand lingered just a second longer than necessary. Not obligation.
Love.
Unquestionable. Matthew stepped back slowly as the car door shut, his mind already moving ahead, connecting pieces, forming conclusions. This wasn't a small secret. This was something significant. Something life-altering. Aurora had a child. And no one had mentioned it. Not Olivia. Not Alexander. No one. Which meant it was being hidden. Deliberately. The car pulled away. Matthew didn't follow this time. He didn't need to. Because what he had seen was enough. More than enough. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts sharper now, more focused than they had ever been. Aurora wasn't just hiding something. She was living an entirely different life. And now, he was part of it. Whether she wanted him to be or not. Matthew's gaze hardened slightly as he turned back toward his car. There were still pieces missing. Still questions unanswered. But one thing was certain now. He was closer to the truth than ever before. And next time, he wouldn't stop at almost. Chapter 27. Betrayal Behind Closed Doors. Matthew hadn't planned to be there. It was supposed to be a quick visit. A file Alexander had requested. A discussion that couldn't wait. Something routine. Something simple. At least, that's what he told himself. The house was quiet when he arrived. Too quiet. He stepped inside without hesitation, acknowledging the staff with a brief nod before making his way down the familiar hallway toward the study. He had been there before. Enough times to know the layout. Enough times to move without needing direction. And yet, something felt different. It wasn't obvious. Not something he could immediately name. Just off. Matthew slowed slightly as he approached the study door. It was closed. Not unusual, but what came from behind it
Was.
a voice.
Low.
Familiar. Olivia. Matthew's hand paused just before the door. His brows drew together slightly. She wasn't supposed to be here. At least, not that he knew of. He hadn't spoken to her about coming. She hadn't mentioned it. And yet, her voice was unmistakable. Matthew stood still, his instincts sharpening instantly. Another voice followed. Alexander. Lower. Controlled. Too controlled. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. Something wasn't right. He should have knocked. Announced himself. That would have been the normal thing to do. But something held him back. Something in the tone. In the silence between their words. He stepped closer instead. Not loudly. Not carelessly. Just enough. And then, he heard it. Not words. Something else.
A shift.
A movement. Too close. Too familiar. Matthew's hand dropped slowly from the door as realization began to settle in.
No.
His mind resisted it immediately. That didn't make sense. It couldn't. But the longer he stood there, the harder it became to deny. Olivia's voice came again. Quieter now. Closer. Followed by silence. Heavy. Not empty. Charged. Matthew exhaled slowly, his chest tightening as something cold began to settle beneath his ribs.
He didn't need to see it.
He already knew. The pieces aligned too quickly. Too clearly. The tension. The familiarity. The way Olivia had been watching everything. The way Alexander had changed. It wasn't separate. It was connected. Matthew took a small step back from the door, his expression hardening as the truth formed completely in his mind. They weren't just talking. They weren't just close. They were involved. The realization didn't come with shock. It came with clarity. And that was worse, because now everything made sense. Olivia's behavior, her control, her possessiveness, not just over him, but over everything. Matthew ran a hand slowly over his jaw, his thoughts shifting rapidly now, moving beyond reaction into something more calculated. This wasn't just betrayal. It was deception, carefully maintained. And he had been standing in the middle of it, without knowing. For how long? The question lingered. But he didn't chase it. Not yet. Because right now, what mattered was what he did next. Matthew glanced once more at the closed door.
He could open it.
Confront them. Expose everything. End it. Right there. But he didn't move. Because instinct told him something else. Something sharper. Revealing this now would give them control. And Matthew was no longer willing to give anyone that. He stepped back fully this time, his expression settling into something calm. Controlled. Silent. Just like them. He turned without making a sound, walking back down the hallway the same way he had come. Unnoticed. Unseen. But no longer unaware. By the time he stepped outside, the air felt different. Clearer. Because now, he understood the game. And more importantly, he understood the players. Olivia. Alexander. Aurora. Nothing was what it seemed. And for the first time, Matthew wasn't on the outside anymore. He was inside it, right at the center. Matthew paused beside his car, his gaze distant as his thoughts settled into something final. He wouldn't confront them.
Not yet.
Because information was power. And now, he had it. A slow breath left him as he opened the car door. Whatever this was, whatever they were hiding, he would use it when the time was right. And when that moment came, none of them would be ready. Chapter 28. The Truth Connects. Matthew didn't sleep that night. Not because he couldn't, but because his mind refused to be still. Too many pieces. Too many questions. Too many things that no longer felt like coincidence. He sat in the dark, the city lights stretching beyond his window, his thoughts replaying everything he had seen. Aurora at the school. The child. The way he had called her. Mummy. Matthew exhaled slowly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he tried to make sense of it. She had a child. That much was no longer a question. But everything else still didn't fit. Why hide him? Why had no one mentioned it? Why did it feel like something she was protecting, not just keeping private? Matthew ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts circling back again. Not randomly, but to one place.
The past.
That night, his jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't thought about it like this before. Not in this way. Because back then, it had been simple. Or at least, he had convinced himself it was. A connection. A moment. Something real. But temporary.
She had left.
He hadn't looked for her. Life had continued. Until it hadn't. Matthew stood slowly, pacing once across the room as the timeline began to form in his mind. The child. 2, maybe 3 years old. Aurora's disappearance after that night. Her sudden return. The secrecy. His steps slowed.
No.
His mind resisted it instantly. That was too easy.
Too convenient.
It couldn't just. He stopped walking. because the more he tried to reject it, the more it refused to fall apart. It held every piece too well. Matthew's breathing shifted slightly, his chest tightening as something deeper began to surface.
Not just logic.
Instinct. A quiet, undeniable recognition that didn't come from thought, but from something else. Something harder to ignore. He saw it again.
The boy.
The way he had moved. The way he had looked up at her. And then, something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to focus on before. The resemblance. It hadn't been obvious. Not at first.
But now.
Now that he was looking for it, he couldn't unsee it. The shape of his eyes. The slight curve of his expression. Familiar. Too familiar. Matthew swallowed slowly, his pulse beginning to rise.
No.
He shook his head once, as if the motion alone could break the thought apart. But it didn't. Because it wasn't just one thing. It was everything. The timing. The secrecy. The connection that had never fully disappeared between him and Aurora. And now, the child. Matthew let out a slow breath, his hands clenching slightly at his sides as the truth began to settle fully. Not as a question, but as an answer.
Alvin.
His gaze lifted slightly, unfocused but intense. That was his name. He didn't know how he knew that, but it felt certain.
Real.
And the moment that thought locked into place, everything else followed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, irreversible clarity. Alvin wasn't just her child. He was. Matthew's chest tightened sharply. His son. The realization didn't come with immediate emotion. It came with stillness. A kind of silence that settled deep inside him, heavier than anything he had felt before. Because this changed everything. Not just the past, but the present. And whatever came next. Matthew turned slowly, his gaze falling back toward the window, but he wasn't seeing the city anymore. He was seeing her.
Aurora.
Every moment. Every look. Every word she hadn't said. She had known. Of course she had. She had carried this alone.
Hidden it.
Protected it. From him. From everyone. Matthew exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing deeper now. Not anger. Not yet. Something else. Something far more complex. Because beneath the shock, beneath the disbelief, there was something undeniable. Connection. Not just to her, but to the child. His child. Matthew closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening as the reality fully settled in. He wasn't guessing anymore. He wasn't questioning. He knew. And that certainty was heavier than anything else. Because now, he had a choice. What to do with the truth. And for the first time, Matthew didn't know what the right answer was. Chapter 29. Love versus Loyalty. Matthew had always believed that decisions were simple. Not easy, but simple. You looked at the facts. You weighed the consequences. You chose the path that made the most sense. But this wasn't simple. Not anymore. He stood by the window again, the same place he had found himself too many times in the past few days, staring out at a city that suddenly felt distant from everything that mattered. Alvin. The name settled heavily in his thoughts. His son. Even now, the words didn't feel entirely real. Not because he doubted them, but because of what they meant. Everything had changed. Without warning. Without permission. Matthew exhaled slowly, his hand resting against the cool surface of the glass as his mind turned over the same question again. What now? The answer should have been obvious. Confront Aurora. Demand the truth. Expose everything. That was the logical choice. The direct choice. But he hadn't done it. And that was the problem. Because the longer he waited, the more complicated it became. Matthew pushed himself away from the window, pacing slowly across the room, his thoughts refusing to settle. If he said nothing, he was protecting her. Protecting her secret. Protecting her life. But at what cost? He clenched his jaw slightly. Because staying silent didn't just affect her. It affected him. And more importantly, it affected the child. His child. Matthew stopped walking, his hands tightening slightly at his sides. That was the part he couldn't ignore. Not Aurora. Not Olivia. Not Alexander. Alvin. A boy who had no idea who he was. No idea what had been hidden from him. Matthew ran a hand over his face, frustration building quietly beneath the surface. He had a right to know, didn't he? The thought came quickly, instinctively, but just as quickly, another followed. Aurora had a reason. She must have, because nothing about her felt careless. Nothing about her felt selfish. Everything she had done, everything she had hidden, had purpose. Matthew's expression tightened slightly, which meant this wasn't just about him. It never had been. His mind shifted again, pulling him in another direction. Olivia. Alexander. The betrayal he had uncovered. That truth sat differently now. Before, it had felt like something separate, something he could choose to act on or ignore.
But now,
it was part of the same web. Everything was connected. If he exposed Aurora, everything else would come with it.
the child.
The affair. The lies. Nothing would remain hidden. Matthew let out a slow breath, the weight of it pressing down harder now. This wasn't just a decision. It was a chain reaction. And once it started, there would be no controlling it. He moved back toward the window again, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He barely recognized the man looking back at him, not because he had changed, but because the situation had. He wasn't standing outside the truth anymore. He was inside it, entangled in it, and every choice he made now would affect more than just him. Matthew's gaze darkened slightly, his thoughts returning to Aurora once again. The way she had looked at the child. The way she had carried everything alone. The weight in her silence. She hadn't told him. Not once. Even when they stood face to face. Even when the past lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. She had chosen to keep him out of it. Matthew swallowed slowly, something tightening in his chest. Was it fear? Or was it trust? The question unsettled him more than anything else. Because if she didn't trust him, why did it feel like she wanted to? Why did it feel like there were things she almost said, but never did? Matthew closed his eyes briefly, his thoughts pulling in opposite directions now. Expose the truth. Protect her. Claim his place. Walk away. Each option carried weight. Each one came with consequences he couldn't fully predict. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which one was right. The silence stretched around him, heavy and unrelenting. Because there was no immediate answer. No clear direction. Only conflict. And the quiet understanding that whatever he chose, someone would get hurt. Matthew opened his eyes slowly, his expression settling into something unreadable. For now, he would wait. Not out of hesitation, but because he needed to understand more. To see more. Before making a move he couldn't take back. But even as that decision formed, the conflict didn't ease. It deepened. Because waiting didn't solve anything. It only delayed the inevitable. And Matthew knew, sooner or later, he would have to choose. Chapter 30. Aurora's collapse. The house had grown quieter. Not in the comforting way Aurora once associated with order and control, but in a way that made every sound feel misplaced. Footsteps lingered too long in the halls. Doors closed with a firmness that felt intentional. Even silence itself seemed to stretch, heavy and watchful, as though it were waiting for something to break. Aurora felt it in the way she moved now. Measured, careful, not out of habit, but awareness. Because lately, nothing felt neutral anymore. Every glance carried weight. Every pause meant something. And tonight, it pressed harder. She sat in the living room, a book resting open in her hands, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Her eyes followed the lines without reading them, her thoughts elsewhere, scattered and uneasy. She didn't need to look up to know he was there. She felt him. Where were you yesterday? The question cut through the silence without warning. Aurora lifted her gaze slowly. Alexander stood across the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made her chest tighten. At home, she replied. He didn't move closer. Didn't sit. All day. A pause. Yes. Silence followed. Longer this time. Aurora held his gaze, refusing to look away, even as something uneasy began to settle beneath her skin. "You're lying." The words were quiet, controlled, and somehow, that made them worse. Aurora felt her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the book. "I'm not," she said, her voice steady, though it cost her more than she wanted to admit. Alexander let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh, but without warmth. "You're becoming predictable." Aurora closed the book slowly, setting it aside as she stood. "I don't understand what you want from me. Try the truth." Her chest tightened. "I am telling you the truth." Alexander stepped closer this time. "No," he said quietly. "You're telling me what you think I'll accept." Aurora felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Something sharper. "And what exactly do you think I'm hiding?" she asked. A brief silence. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The answer came too quickly. Too easily. Aurora stared at him. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something else. "You're imagining things," she said, though her voice had softened, just slightly. Alexander tilted his head. "Am I?" The room felt smaller. The air heavier. Aurora took a step back without meaning to. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she said. "But this isn't fair." "Fair," he repeated. There was no anger in his voice. Just something cold. "You walk around like everything is exactly as it should be," he continued. "Like you have nothing to answer for." Aurora's breath caught. "Because I don't," she said. But the words didn't land the way she wanted them to. Alexander let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You really believe that?" Aurora didn't answer. Because suddenly, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Alexander closed the distance between them completely now. "I see the way you behave," he said. "The way you think no one notices." Her heart skipped. "What are you talking about?" But her voice had changed. And he heard it. "Careful," he said softly. "You're starting to sound nervous." "I'm not nervous," she replied quickly. "Then you won't mind me asking questions." It wasn't a threat, but it felt like one. Aurora turned away slightly, her composure slipping, piece by piece. "This isn't a marriage," she said quietly. Alexander went still. "What did you say?" She turned back to face him, her restraint cracking now. "I said this isn't a marriage," she repeated. "This is control." Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. "You agreed to this," he said. Aurora let out a soft, broken laugh. "I agreed to a partnership," she replied. "Not this." "And what exactly is this?" Aurora hesitated, because the truth was too dangerous to say out loud. "This," she whispered, "is suffocating." The word lingered between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alexander stepped back. Not in retreat. In decision. "If you have something to say," he said coldly, "then say it." Aurora shook her head. "I don't."
A lie.
A necessary one. Because she had too much to say. And none of it could be spoken. Alexander watched her for a moment longer. Then he turned away. "Then stop acting like you do." The dismissal hit harder than anything else. Because it was final. Aurora stood there unmoving, as the weight of everything settled all at once. The suspicion. The pressure. The constant need to hold herself together. It all came crashing down. And this time, she couldn't hold it. Her breath broke first. Then her composure. Aurora sank slowly to the floor, her hands trembling as the tears came. Stronger now. Heavier. Impossible to stop. There was no one to see it. No one to interrupt it. No one to understand it. Because no one knew the truth. Not all of it. And carrying it alone was breaking her. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking as the words finally escaped. But even as she said them, she knew she had no choice. Because everything she was protecting, everything she was hiding, depended on her holding on. And yet, she was slipping. Aurora covered her face as the weight of it consumed her completely. Not just the marriage, not just the lies, everything. And, in that moment, she reached her limit. Chapter 31. The Public Scandal. The dinner was meant to be perfect. That was the expectation. That was always the expectation. The Davenport estate had been prepared meticulously, every detail curated to reflect wealth, control, and prestige. Crystal glasses lined the table, soft lighting cast a warm glow across polished surfaces, and quiet conversations floated through the air like carefully rehearsed performances. Aurora moved through it all like she had done 100 times before. Graceful,
Composed.
unreachable. But tonight, something felt wrong. Not visibly, not immediately, but beneath the surface. There was tension, the kind that didn't belong in a room like this. Her mother's voice carried lightly from across the table, engaged in conversation with one of the guests, her laughter controlled, measured, perfect. As always, Mrs. Kinsley didn't look at Aurora once. Not really. And somehow, that felt intentional. Aurora's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. She had learned to ignore it. The distance, the expectations, the constant need to be flawless. But tonight, it pressed harder. Across from her, Alexander sat in silence, his expression unreadable, his presence cold and distant. And beside him, Olivia, smiling, always smiling. Aurora's chest tightened slightly. There was something about the way Olivia carried herself tonight.
Too calm.
Too certain, like she knew something no one else did, and was waiting. The conversation around the table continued, flowing easily between business, alliances, and subtle negotiations masked as casual discussion. Everything looked normal, until Olivia set her glass down. Softly, but deliberately. "I think," she said, her voice cutting through the room with quiet precision, "we should address something." The shift was immediate. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Aurora felt it before she even looked at her. That moment, when everything changes. "What is it, Olivia?" Mrs. Kinsley asked, her tone polite, but edged with curiosity. Olivia smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hired someone recently," she said, her voice smooth. "A private investigator." The room stilled. Aurora's heart skipped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. "Why would you need that?" someone asked lightly, though the tension had already begun to creep in. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting, slowly, deliberately, until it landed on Aurora. "To confirm something that didn't feel right," she replied. Aurora's breath tightened. "And what did you find?" Alexander asked.
His voice was calm.
But something beneath it had sharpened. Olivia's smile deepened. "Not what I expected," she said. A pause. Long enough to pull everyone in. Something much bigger. Aurora's fingers curled against the table. "Stop." But the word never reached her lips. Because Olivia was already continuing. "It turns out," she said, her voice almost conversational, "that Aurora hasn't been as transparent as we all believed." The room shifted again. This time, heavier. Aurora felt every eye slowly turn toward her. Her pulse began to rise. "Olivia," she said quietly, a warning in her tone. "This isn't the place." Olivia didn't look at her. "That depends," she replied calmly. "I think everyone here deserves to know who they're really sitting with." A murmur spread across the table. Mrs. Kinsley's expression tightened slightly. "What are you implying?" she asked. Olivia's gaze returned to Aurora. And this time, it held. "I'm not implying anything," she said. "I'm stating a fact." The silence that followed felt suffocating. And then, "Aurora has a child." The words landed like a fracture through the room. Sharp. Irreversible. Everything stopped. Aurora didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't react. Because, for a moment, she couldn't. It felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. "No," Mrs. Kinsley said immediately. Not in defense. In rejection. "That's not possible." Olivia didn't break eye contact with Aurora. "It is," she said simply. "The child exists. I have confirmation." Whispers broke out around the table.
Shock.
Disbelief.
Curiosity.
Aurora could hear it all, but none of it felt real. Her chest tightened painfully, her hands trembling slightly beneath the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not here. Not in front of everyone. "Aurora," her mother's voice came again, sharper this time. Say something. Aurora looked at her. Really looked at her. And what she saw wasn't concern. It wasn't fear for her daughter. It was calculation. Damage control. How could you let something like this happen? Mrs. Kinsley continued, her voice low but cutting. Do you understand what this means? The kind of damage this could cause? Aurora's chest tightened further. Not are you okay? But damage. Business. Reputation. That was all that mattered. Her father sat there quietly, not saying a word. Not saying they knew about this and forced her into a marriage arrangement for their selfish business reasons. Aurora's voice broke. But no words followed. Because there was nothing she could say that would fix this. Nothing that would undo what had just been exposed. Across the table, Alexander sat in complete silence. But his gaze was fixed on her,
Cold.
and filled with something she couldn't fully read. Disappointment. Suspicion. Something darker. Olivia watched it all unfold, her expression calm, satisfied. Because this was exactly what she wanted. The room had descended into chaos now. Voices overlapping. Questions rising. Is it true? When did this happen? How could this have been hidden? Aurora couldn't answer any of them. She couldn't even hear them clearly anymore. Because everything around her felt like it was collapsing. Her secret. Her child. Her life. Exposed. And the one person who should have stood beside her had already stepped away. Aurora pushed her chair back abruptly, the sound cutting through the noise as she stood. I didn't, she started, her voice shaking. But the words fell apart before they could form. Because there was no control left. No composure. Only truth. And the consequences of it. And as the room erupted further, Aurora stood in the center of it all. Alone. Chapter 32. Chaos and Shame. The room didn't settle after the revelation. It fractured. Voices overlapped, rising and falling in sharp waves. Questions, whispers, disbelief wrapped in thinly veiled judgment. Aurora heard her name more times than she could count. Not spoken. Passed around. Like something scandalous. Something tainted. She stood there unmoving, as the weight of it pressed in from every direction. No one tried to shield her. No one tried to quiet the room. Not even her own family. Mrs. Kinsley had already shifted her attention elsewhere, her voice low and controlled as she spoke urgently with one of the guests, her tone laced with quiet damage control. Aurora watched her. Just for a moment. And that was all it took. To understand. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about perception. Reputation.
Control.
Aurora's chest tightened painfully as she looked away. Around her, the whispers grew louder. I knew something felt off. A whole child? Hidden like that? This is beyond scandal. Each word landed. Not loudly, but deeply. Because they weren't asking. They were judging. Aurora swallowed, her throat dry, her body suddenly too heavy to carry itself. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't breathe here. Without another word, she turned and walked away. No one stopped her. No one called her back. The sound of voices followed her out of the room, down the hallway, fading only slightly as she moved further away, but never completely disappearing. Because the truth had already spread. And there was no taking it back. By the time she reached the far end of the corridor, her vision had begun to blur. Not from tears. Not yet. But from everything pressing too hard, too fast. She stopped abruptly, her hand bracing against the wall as her breathing grew uneven. I didn't want this. The words slipped out under her breath. Not as an explanation. Not as a defense. Just truth. A quiet, broken truth. I didn't want this. But it didn't matter what she wanted anymore. Because it had already happened. The exposure. The humiliation. Her son. Dragged into a world she had spent years protecting him from. Aurora closed her eyes tightly, her chest tightening as the first tear finally fell. Then another. And then, she couldn't stop it. Her shoulders trembled as everything she had held in for so long finally broke through, her hand pressing harder against the wall as if it could somehow keep her standing. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was. You shouldn't be alone right now. The voice came quietly,
Carefully.
Aurora froze. For a moment, she didn't turn, because she already knew. She knew that voice. She felt it before she saw him. Matthew. He stood a few steps behind her, not too close, not too far, just enough to be there without overwhelming her. Aurora wiped quickly at her face, though it did nothing to hide the truth of how broken she felt. "I'm fine," she said. It was automatic, a reflex, and they both knew it wasn't true. Matthew didn't argue, didn't correct her. Instead, he took a slow step closer. "Then stay," he said gently. "Just for a second." Aurora let out a shaky breath, her composure slipping again despite herself. "I can't do this," she whispered. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "You don't have to do anything right now." She shook her head. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Everything is ruined." Matthew watched her for a moment. Then quietly, "I understand more than you think." Aurora frowned slightly, turning to look at him fully now. There was something in his expression. Not confusion. Not curiosity.
Certainty.
And it unsettled her. "What does that mean?" she asked softly. Matthew held her gaze. For a second it seemed like he might say it. Everything. The truth. But he didn't.
Not now.
Not like this. Instead, his voice softened. "You've been carrying this alone for a long time," he said. Aurora's breath caught. Because it wasn't a question. It was understanding. And that hurt more than anything else. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. Matthew stepped closer again. "You always had a choice." Aurora shook her head immediately.
"No," she said.
"Not one that didn't destroy everything." Her voice trembled again, her strength slipping further. "I was trying to protect him." The words came out before she could stop them. And the moment they did, she froze. Matthew's expression shifted slightly. Not in surprise, but in confirmation. Aurora's eyes widened just a fraction as realization hit her. "You know," she said. It wasn't a question. Matthew didn't deny it. Didn't look away. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it changed everything. Aurora stared at him, her chest tightening all over again, but this time, it wasn't just fear. It was exposure. Complete. "How long?" she asked. "Long enough," he replied. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't faced. Aurora looked away first, her voice breaking again. "I never wanted you to find out like this." Matthew exhaled slowly. "I should have known sooner." Aurora let out a soft, broken laugh.
"No," she said.
"You shouldn't have known at all." That landed harder than she intended. Matthew felt it, but he didn't react. Because right now, this wasn't about him. It was about her. Aurora sank slowly to the floor again, her strength giving out completely this time. "I've lost everything," she whispered. Matthew crouched in front of her, his voice low, steady. "You haven't lost everything." She shook her head. "You don't understand," she said again. "They'll never let this go. My family, his family, everyone." Her voice faded. "They'll destroy me." Matthew's gaze darkened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." Aurora looked at him. There was something in his tone. Something different. Not comfort. Not reassurance. Something stronger. Something final. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she didn't feel completely alone. But it didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the damage. It didn't take away the shame pressing down on her from every direction. Aurora lowered her gaze again, her voice barely audible. "I'm so tired." Matthew didn't respond immediately, because there was nothing he could say to make that go away. So instead, he stayed, right there, with her. And as the silence settled around them again, his thoughts shifted, away from confusion, away from hesitation, into something sharper, clearer. Olivia, Alexander. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated, deliberate, and they had chosen their moment perfectly. To hurt her, to expose her, to break her. Matthew's jaw tightened slightly as something cold settled beneath his calm exterior. They had crossed a line. And now, they would answer for it. He looked at Aurora again, her fragile state grounding his decision completely. This wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about protection.
And justice.
I won't let them get away with this, he said quietly. Aurora didn't respond. She didn't even look up, because she was already at her limit, already broken in ways that words couldn't reach. But Matthew had just made a decision. And this time, he wouldn't stay silent. Chapter 33. The Counterattack. The meeting was not an invitation. It was a summons. Aurora knew that the moment she was told, "Your mother wants everyone in the West sitting room," one of the staff had said earlier that morning, their tone careful, neutral. But there was nothing neutral about it. Not after last night. Aurora stood outside the room now, her hand resting lightly against the door, her chest tight, her thoughts heavy. She already knew what this was. Not concern, not support, control. She pushed the door open. The room was already filled. Her parents, Alexander, members of the Davenport family, all seated, all waiting, and at the center of it, Mrs. Kinsley, composed as ever. Aurora stepped inside slowly, every movement feeling deliberate under the weight of their attention. No one greeted her. No one softened. "Sit," Mrs. Kinsley said. Aurora obeyed, because she knew better than not to. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, "We will handle this quietly," Mrs. Kinsley began, her voice calm, controlled, "before it escalates beyond repair." Aurora felt something twist inside her. Handle, like she was a situation. A problem, not a person. "You have put this family in a very difficult position," her mother continued. "One that affects not just us, but the Davenports as well." Aurora looked down at her hands. Steady. Still. Because if she looked up, she might break again. "We need clarity," Mr. Davenport added, his tone firm. "When did this happen? And why was it hidden?" Aurora didn't answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because none of it mattered. Not to them. "This silence is not helping you," Mrs. Kinsley said sharply. Aurora let out a slow breath. "I didn't tell you," she said quietly, "because I knew this is exactly how you would react." The room stilled. Mrs. Kinsley's expression hardened. "This is not about my reaction," she replied. "This is about consequences." Aurora looked up then. "And what about me?" she asked. A pause. Brief. Dismissive. "This is bigger than you, Aurora." The words landed harder than anything else, because they confirmed everything. She didn't matter. Not really. Alexander finally spoke. "Who is the father?" The question cut through the room cleanly. Aurora's breath caught. There it was. The one question she had been avoiding. The one answer that would destroy everything. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said carefully. "It's very relevant," Alexander replied, his tone colder now. "Considering the position you're in." Aurora's chest tightened. Position. Like she was something to be negotiated. To be fixed. "I won't answer that," she said. The tension in the room shifted immediately. "You don't get to refuse," Mrs. Kinsley snapped. Aurora's eyes flickered. For a moment, fear surfaced. But then, something else replaced it. Exhaustion. "I'm not discussing my child like this," she said quietly. A murmur spread across the room. And then, "Maybe I can help with that." The voice came from the doorway. Calm. Measured. Matthew. Every head turned. Aurora's heart stopped. He stepped into the room slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces gathered there before settling, briefly, on her. Not with pity. With intention. "This is a private family matter," Mr. Davenport said sharply. Matthew didn't stop walking. "I'm aware," he replied, "which is why I think the truth should be complete." Something in his tone shifted the room. Subtle, but undeniable. Alexander's gaze narrowed. "What are you implying?" Matthew stopped at the center of the room. And then, he looked directly at him. "I'm implying that we're asking the wrong questions." Silence fell. Thick. Dangerous. Aurora felt it. The shift. Something was about to happen. "Before we demand answers from Aurora," Matthew continued, his voice steady, "maybe we should address something else first." Olivia stiffened slightly. Barely noticeable. But not to him. Matthew's gaze moved to her. Held. Unrelenting. What are you doing? Olivia asked lightly, though there was tension beneath it. Matthew didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch. Then, you hired an investigator, he said, to uncover a secret. Olivia's smile returned.
Yes.
And I found one. Matthew nodded once. You did. A pause. And so did I. The room shifted. This time, violently. Olivia's expression flickered. Just for a second. What are you talking about? Alexander asked. Matthew's gaze returned to him. You and Olivia. The words landed. Hard. What? Mr. Davenport's voice rose immediately. Matthew didn't look away. You're not just cousins, he said calmly. You're involved. The room erupted. No, that's absurd. This is ridiculous. But Matthew didn't stop. I saw you, he added. In your office. You weren't careful enough. Silence. Sudden. Complete. All eyes shifted to Olivia. Then to Alexander. Waiting. Demanding. Olivia's composure cracked first. Just slightly. Enough. This is a lie, she said quickly. But it didn't land. Because Alexander hadn't spoken. Hadn't denied it. Aurora's breath caught as she looked at him. Really looked. And, in that moment,
She saw it.
the truth. Not in words, but in silence. Everything began to unravel. You've been manipulating this entire situation, Matthew continued, his voice cutting through the tension. Creating distractions. Shifting attention. His gaze returned to Olivia. Because if anyone looked too closely at you, a pause, they would find something much worse. No one spoke. No one moved. Because the balance of power had just shifted.
Completely.
Aurora sat frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. The humiliation. The exposure. It wasn't just hers anymore. The truth was spreading. And this time, she wasn't the only one standing in it. End of Chapter 33 Firebomb. Chapter 34. The Fall of Pretense. The room didn't recover. It couldn't. What Matthew had revealed hung in the air like something poisonous, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. No one spoke at first,
Because no one knew how to.
the Davenport name, carefully built, fiercely protected, had just been dragged through something it could not control. Mr. Davenport's face had gone rigid, his composure cracking beneath the weight of humiliation. Whispers broke out again, but this time, they weren't about Aurora. They were about them. Olivia sat frozen, her earlier confidence gone, her expression pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. And Alexander. Alexander said nothing. He didn't defend her.
Didn't deny it.
Didn't even attempt to regain control of the narrative that had just slipped completely out of his grasp.
He simply sat there. Still.
Quiet, but not untouched. Because beneath the silence, his pride had taken the hit. And it showed. The room waited. For denial. For outrage. For something. Instead, Alexander exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting lazily toward Olivia. And then,
He spoke.
she wanted it, he said flatly. The words landed like a slap. Olivia's head snapped toward him, her eyes widening. Alexander. She wanted me, he continued, his tone cold, detached. At all costs. A murmur rippled through the room. Olivia's composure shattered completely. That's not true, she said quickly, her voice breaking. You made it easy, he cut in. No emotion. No hesitation. Just dismissal. Aurora felt something twist inside her as she watched it unfold. Not sympathy. Something else. Recognition. Because this was who he was. Not the man he presented to the world. The man behind it. And now, everyone could see it. Alexander shifted his attention then.
To her. Aurora.
His gaze held hers, steady, unreadable. Well, he said calmly, as if nothing significant had just happened. Now that everything is out. A pause. We can move forward. Aurora blinked.
Once. Slowly.
What? Our secrets are no longer secrets, he continued. Which means there's no reason to pretend anymore. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was disbelief. We can't forget this, Alexander added. And continue as planned. Aurora stared at him. Really stared. Waiting for something. Anything. That would make those words make sense. But nothing came. Because he meant it. And then, yes, Mrs. Kinsley said. The word was calm.
Certain.
Aurora turned sharply toward her. Her mother's expression was composed, her voice measured as she continued. This situation is already unstable. A divorce would only worsen things. We fix this quietly and move forward. Aurora felt something inside her finally. Snap. Not break. Not crack. Snap. Are you serious? She asked, her voice trembling, not with weakness, but disbelief. Mrs. Kinsley's gaze sharpened immediately. You will not speak to me like that. Aurora let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh. I need to ask, she said, her voice rising now, emotion breaking through fully. Because you act like you hate me. The room stilled. You act like I'm nothing, she continued, her chest rising and falling unevenly. Like I'm some piece of damage you need to clean up. Aurora, her mother warned. No, she cut in. For the first time, she didn't stop herself. I won't take it anymore. Silence. Real silence. Aurora turned back to Alexander, her expression shifting into something clear. Final. You'll be hearing from my lawyers on Monday, she said. The words were steady, unshaking. Try not to make it difficult, she added. Just sign the divorce papers when you get them. A ripple of shock moved through the room. But Aurora didn't look at anyone else. She was done. Completely done. Alexander studied her for a moment. Then, almost casually, I have just one question. Aurora didn't respond. Who is the father of your child? The room held its breath. Aurora felt it. The weight of it. The moment. This was it. She opened her mouth. But before she could speak, I am. The voice cut through the room. Clear. Unapologetic. Matthew. Every head turned. Aurora's breath caught as she looked at him. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed, not on the room, but on Alexander. And if she hadn't walked away, he continued, his voice calm but edged with something unshakable, if she hadn't allowed the fear of people who never cared about her to control her decisions. A pause. You still wouldn't have stood a chance. The words landed hard. Final. You deserve nothing good. Silence followed. Heavy. Complete. Because this time, there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to control. Matthew turned to Aurora then. Everything in his expression softened. You want to get out of here? He asked quietly, extending his hand toward her. Aurora looked at him. At the hand. At the choice. And for the first time, it felt like one. Not obligation. Not expectation. Choice. She took it. Without hesitation. And as their hands met, something shifted. Not in the room. In her. Matthew didn't look back as they walked toward the door. Aurora didn't either. Because behind them, there was nothing left worth staying for. Chapter 35. A Life She Chose. Peace felt unfamiliar at first. Not because Aurora had never experienced it, but because she had never been allowed to keep it. Now it stayed. It lived in the quiet mornings where nothing demanded her attention, in the soft laughter that filled rooms without tension, in the absence of expectation, and most of all, in Alvin. Aurora stood by the window, watching as he ran across the garden, his small legs moving with determined excitement as he chased after something only he could see. His laughter carried through the air, light and unrestrained. Free. A soft smile touched her lips. This was everything she had fought for. Careful. Matthew's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. He's convinced he can outrun the wind. Aurora let out a quiet laugh as Matthew stepped beside her, his presence steady, grounding. He gets that from you, she said. Matthew raised a brow. I don't run from things. Aurora turned to look at him, her eyes soft but knowing. No, she said gently. You face them. A pause settled between them. Not heavy, not complicated, just real. Matthew's gaze lingered on her, something unspoken passing between them, something that had grown stronger, deeper, with every passing day. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her fingers. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. Aurora tilted her head slightly. "Being here," he clarified. "Without everything else." Aurora looked out at the garden again. At Alvin. At the life in front of her. "It feels," she exhaled softly, searching for the right word. "Like mine." Matthew smiled. And, in that moment, it was enough. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something steady. Matthew didn't just step into their lives. He became part of them. Not forcefully. Not uncertainly. But naturally. He learned Alvin's routines, his favorite stories, the way he laughed at the smallest things. And Alvin accepted him without hesitation. Because children always knew what felt safe, what felt real. Aurora watched it happen slowly. The way Matthew softened around her son. The way his voice changed. The way his presence became something constant. Not just for her, but for both of them. And somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling like she was holding everything together alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low across the horizon, painting the sky in soft gold and fading light, Matthew found her in the garden. Alvin had fallen asleep inside. The house was quiet, peaceful. Matthew stood in front of her, his expression different this time. More serious, but not heavy. Intentional. "I don't want this to just be something we found," he said. Aurora frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Matthew took a small step closer. "I want to choose it," he said. "Every day. Openly. Without anything standing in the way." Aurora's heart softened. And then, he reached into his pocket. Her breath caught. "This time," he continued, his voice steady, "it's not circumstance. It's not pressure." A pause. "It's you." Aurora's eyes filled, not with sadness, but something else. Relief. Freedom.
Choice.
"Yes," she whispered. And this time, she meant it without hesitation. The wedding was small, private. No grand audience. No expectations. No negotiations hidden behind polite smiles. Just a quiet ceremony surrounded by people who mattered. And nothing else. Aurora stood across from Matthew, her hands in his, her heart steady in a way it had never been before. There was no fear. No doubt. Only certainty. And when she said "I do," it felt different. Because this time, it was hers. Completely. Later, as the night settled around them and the world faded into something distant and unimportant, Aurora found herself in his arms, laughter slipping easily between them as the weight of everything they had been through finally gave way to something lighter. Matthew brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze soft. "We made it," he said. Aurora smiled. "No," she corrected gently. "We chose it. And that made all the difference." Time moved forward. Not rushed. Not uncertain. But steady. Until one quiet afternoon, the past returned. Not loudly. Not forcefully. But carefully. Aurora opened the door. And there they stood. Her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Kinsley. For a moment, no one spoke. They looked different. Not in appearance, but in presence. Less certain. Less composed. Almost fragile. Mrs. Kinsley's eyes moved past Aurora briefly, taking in the home behind her. The life. The peace. Everything they had once tried to control, now built without them. Her grip tightened slightly around the gift in her hand. She began. Then stopped. Because for the first time, she didn't have the right words. Aurora waited. Not cold. Not distant. Just still. And then, "I'm sorry," Mrs. Kinsley said. The words were quiet, but they carried everything. For everything. Aurora held her gaze. And for the first time, she saw it. Not control. Not pride. Regret. Real. Unfiltered. Behind her, Matthew stepped closer, his presence steady but silent. Not interfering. Just there. Aurora took a slow breath. The past stood in front of her. But it didn't define her anymore, because everything she had now, she had built, chosen, protected, and finally, kept. Aurora stepped aside, not fully, but enough. And that was the beginning of something new, not perfect, but real. The end.
I'm sure you enjoyed listening to this story. Kindly leave a comment, and let me know where you are listening from. I would really love to connect with you. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.